Before I call Michael Matheson to speak and move the motion, can I just point out to members that we have a fair bit of time in hand, so the presiding officers will be generous with you in their speeches. I call Michael Matheson to speak to move the motion. Minister, you've got 14 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Keys to Life, the new Learning Disability Strategy, was published in June of this year. It's the second National Learning Disability Strategy for Scotland, and we are the first part of the UK to bring forward a second strategy of this nature. As a nation, we can be proud of some of the changes in the quality of life for people with learning disabilities since the Same as You strategy, which was our original learning disability policy published in 2000. It was highly successful in shifting the balance of care to support more people to live in their community. It led to the historic closure of over 1,000 long-stay hospital beds that many people called their homes for decades. It also led to improved day opportunities, and it also created employment and meaningful activities for those with a learning disability. The human rights of people with learning disabilities are at the heart of the Keys to Life strategy. I believe that these are the rights and freedoms everyone should have, and that our statutory agencies should be transparent in demonstrating how they respect and uphold human rights in all of their policies and practice. And what people with learning disabilities need is information, so that they know what their human rights are. Since the Same as You, people with learning disabilities tell us that they are generally more accepted and valued in their communities than they were before. And rightly, they are seen as people who can contribute to Scottish society in a positive way. But to be truly accepted in society means being treated equally and fairly in other ways. This means having a health service that is committed to changing the fact that people with a learning disability can still die 20 years earlier than the general population. This is simply unacceptable. Their lives and life choices matter as much as any other citizens. We must make it a national priority to address the stark health inequalities faced by people with learning disabilities. Much of the emphasis in this 10-year strategy is on health issues in order to help make this change. It's about improving health practice and outcomes so that people's human rights are respected and upheld. If we do not achieve this shift, Presiding Officer, in my view, as a society, we will have failed to ensure that people with learning disabilities enjoy the same rights as everyone else. We all want people with learning disabilities to be healthier generally. And for that to happen, those who work in healthcare need to better understand the health needs of people with learning disabilities. We also want all health professionals, not just those who work in specialist learning disability posts, to know how the health needs of people with learning disabilities can differ from the general population. We already know a lot about the health needs of people with a learning disability. For around 4 years, the Scottish Government has led a national learning disability health inequality network, which consists of senior health professionals who come together to identify ways in which we can tackle these stark health inequalities more effectively. Through their work, they have developed projects which have been about self-care, prevention, awareness raising and also training. For example, the Take 5 programme in Glasgow is an effective way for adults with learning disabilities to lose weight by having a personalised diet and by increasing exercise. Another good example is in NHS Western Isles Learning Disability Collaborative, which has an electronic health assessment linked to GP health records so that individuals get regular health screening. However, I want to build on the progress that has been made in recent years, which is why I've commissioned the Scottish Learning Disabilities Observatory to provide us with evidence and data required not only to take action on the basis of improved understanding, but also to clearly demonstrate improvements from these actions. And to assist us with this, I intend to develop a heat target to capture the evidence and the data that will help to support this transition. The Observatory are also committed to helping us to better address the causes of unnecessary deaths of people with learning disabilities, and this work will help to inform the interventions we need to take forward in the years to come to address this issue. The role of primary care is integral to our success, which is why an early task will be to explore how the GP contract in Scotland can best meet the needs of people with learning disabilities, including the possibility of the reintroduction of an enhanced service. Another aspect of the primary care role will ultimately be for the development of annual reporting of trends in the management of long-term conditions for those with a learning disability. I recognise that having to go to hospital or attending a healthcare setting can be an anxious time for anyone and can often be more so for people with a learning disability. Small things can matter here, like having both the emergency care summary and the key information summary to meeting the information needs of people with learning disabilities when they're accessing healthcare services. So it's essential that services work together to make sure people with learning disabilities get the right level of support when they're in hospital and that they have access to the right medical services. Most importantly, people with learning disabilities get the same treatment as the general population. People with profound and multiple learning disabilities face particular challenges in their daily lives. It could be simple things like facilities available to use as a toilet. This results in situations which are simply unacceptable, like families changing their daughter or their son on a toilet floor, which is undignified and unhygienic and involves heavy lifting for carers, which can potentially cause serious harm to their own health. Sometimes families opt to stay home with increased isolation and a lack of stimulation as a result. That's why one of the recommendations in the new strategy will be to extend the number of change-in-place toilets in Scotland, which is designed to allow access for all. And I want to take this opportunity in Parliament to thank the tremendous amount of work that's been taken forward by PAMIS over the years in this particular area and the work that they intend to take forward in assisting us to address this issue in the future. A challenge for others, and one which I'm committed to addressing, is the fact that for some parents and carers of people with complex needs, they have to visit their children in facilities out with Scotland. I appreciate how difficult this must be for them to maintain regular contact, and I recognise that it can be upsetting and distressing for them and their children. Everyone deserves to live near family and friends. That's why we've established a group to look at how we can better deliver services for people with complex care needs more locally here in Scotland. In other words, where we can and will bring home those much closer to their own home to meet their care needs. Underpinning all of this activity is to also make sure that people with learning disabilities and their families know what is available to them. Alongside that, it's important they have confidence that the support which is available to them is of a high quality. We already have learning disability quality indicators, and we have a review of general health services and specialist learning disability health services, which will help us to make sure that in NHS Scotland that we are being fully compliant with the quality indicators we've laid down. Ongoing objective scrutiny in terms of progress in this area is key to the success in making sure that we make further progress, which is why I've asked the Care Inspectorate and Healthcare Improvement Scotland to ensure that strategic commissioning, both process and its implementation, are examined as part of their overall inspection of services for people with learning disabilities. Presiding Officer, so far I've concentrated on the anticipated positive changes in health. But life is about much more than this. At the very heart of the Keys to Life strategy is the principle that individuals should have greater choice and control over their life. This is the very same principle that's central to the self-directed support legislation passed by this Parliament and which will come into force next year. But the new legislation is more than just the Act in itself. We need to make sure that we challenge our local authorities to meet the aspirations set out within self-directed support and also the Keys to Life strategies. We need to support professionals to engage with self-directed support as part of their core practice. And we need to also make sure that we provide clear and unambiguous guidance to emphasise that support is about a whole variety of lifestyle issues. And we need to make sure that we reform the commissioning processes which are being used by our local authorities. At a very basic level, we need to tackle the lack of awareness around the options that are available to people under the new legislation. And the benefits of the self-directed support legislation, I believe, are very clear. Councils and providers have an important role to play in ensuring the legislation is effectively taken forward. The same as you, encourage local authorities to review their daycare services. And in the past 13 years, we have seen considerable change in the way in which day services are delivered. A range of models are now in place across Scotland, some of which involve little or no contact with day centres and others which involve a balance of centre-based and community-based activities. However, I'm aware that for many people, day centres will still play an important part of their support arrangements, especially those who have more complex needs and people with profound and multiple learning disabilities. It's still essential that services and their staff continue to develop personalised care approaches that enable people to make choice and to follow activities that are meaningful to them, including the choice of being able to use a daycare facility. I know that living an independent life is important to people with learning disabilities. This means having the same choice and control in their life as others have. Other policies which are... I'll give way to the member.
Stuart Maxwell.
Thank you very much in taking the intervention. You'll be aware the Education Committee has undertaken an inquiry into looked after children and some of the outcomes that follow from decisions made by professionals. In that inquiry, we took evidence from parents who had learning disabilities, and the fact that they stated, and I think research backs this up, that perhaps as many as 40% of them have their children taken away and put into residential and other forms of care. How does that match with the individual approach that should be taken by professionals in treating each case on an individual basis, rather than perhaps looking at learning disabled parents as a homogenous group?
Minister.
I think the member has raised a very important point, and I'm aware of the concerns which she has raised. And one of the issues which I was going to touch upon is the issue of transition between services, particularly those who are receiving care through the education side and moving into adulthood, and how we can get that transition better. And a key part of that is how we can make sure that we translate the GIRFIC principles much more effectively into how that is then managed in terms of the transition from children and young people services into adult services. And the issue that the member has raised is one which I think can best be addressed through issues such as the Children and Young People's Bill, which is a mechanism which allows us to make sure that we take a much more targeted approach, but also that we have a range of services in place to help to support young people and their families to make informed choices. And I think in doing that, we can make sure that those parents that feel that the system works against them at the present time works more in the interest of the young person and their parents at that point to make the right type of choice. And on the issue of transition, I recognise that many people with learning disabilities need that additional support when they leave school in order to have meaningful education and employment, in order to have a smoother and clearer pathway into education and employment. And the Keys to Life has got specific recommendations around how we can make sure that local authorities, further education, Skills Development Scotland and the Transition Forum can work more closely together in order to make sure that the GIRFIC framework can better prepare those young people with a learning disability when they are leaving school. We also need to make sure that young people get access to accessible information to support them understand all of the options that are open to them, and that they are able to make the right choices that are available to them. There is an expectation that personal life plans will be an integral part of the commissioning plans to inform the type of high-quality services which we expect to be provided in order to support individuals achieve better outcomes for themselves. Getting people into employment is a national priority. We know that most people with learning disabilities want work to be paid employment. In order to do this, we need to provide more training and education places available for them. The Scottish Consortium for Learning Disabilities will work with Scotland's colleges and Skills Development Scotland to make sure that this happens. Also, the National Learning Disability Implementation Group will work with local authorities, the NHS and the third sector to help open up employment opportunities within those agencies for people with learning disabilities. Presiding Officer, I'm conscious that we have made significant progress in recent years in improving the way in which services are provided for those with a learning disability and improving their life chances. However, there is still much to be done, and this new strategy I would commend to Parliament, and I move the motion in my name.
Thank you very much, Minister. And I now call on Neil Bibby to speak to and to move Amendment 7787.2. Around 10 minutes or so, Mr Bibby.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to start this afternoon by making clear Scottish Labour's commitment to improving the quality of life for people with learning disabilities, and for that reason we welcome the debate this afternoon and the opportunity to examine how best we act to turn that aim into reality. As the Minister has said, the previous strategy, the same as you, introduced in 2000 by the Labour-led executive, has been hugely influential in changing attitudes and increasing support for people with learning disabilities. We therefore welcome the fact that the underlying principles of that strategy are reflected in the Government's Keys to Life publication. As I said before in this chamber, we will support the Government where we agree and believe they are doing things right, but obviously point to areas where we believe they could and should be doing more. As the Government refreshingly acknowledges in the motion, there is more to do, and we need to work across party lines to achieve that. We know from the most recent statistics that there are more than 26,000 adults and 16,000 children and young people with learning disabilities who require support. According to the Learning Disability Alliance Scotland, these people want three main things: a secure and safe place to stay, meaningful things to do with their time, and friends and family to have in their life. I don't think anyone across this chamber would argue when I say these are things that everybody wants and things that should not be too much to ask for. Our challenge, therefore, is to make sure that adequate support is provided to those who need it to allow them to fulfil these aims. So we welcome the publication of the new strategy and support to drive to deliver better outcomes for people with learning disabilities, as well as their families and carers in the areas of life that they say are the most important to them. However, there are considerable challenges that need to be addressed if we are to ensure this doesn't simply fall into the trap of becoming another strategy that sounds good on paper, but in reality has little impact on the ground. Rhetoric must be turned into reality if this strategy is to be deemed a success. Organisations like the Learning Disability Alliance Scotland have expressed reservations about the lack of an overarching theme to the strategy, which we must take heed of. As I'm sure many members have discovered for themselves in the last few days, the Keys for Life is a lengthy strategy stretching to over 170 pages and detailing 52 separate recommendations. Although the strategy declares a human rights focus, we need to make sure that people with learning disabilities are at the centre of the improvement to the quality of their lives. In other words, Presiding Officer, we need to make sure we are working with people rather than talking at people. We must also look at some of the challenges outside of the strategy itself, which will undoubtedly have an impact on its success. It is essential that the Scottish Government takes action to ensure that we have a fair, consistent and transparent system of care for disabled people established across Scotland. Resources continue to present a huge challenge to the delivery of support services. Local authorities of all colours are struggling with the pressures of delivering services in the face of vastly reduced budgets. As a result, we've seen a sharp increase in the use of care charges. Some authorities are charging as much as 100%, while 25 of the 32 local authority areas charge a rate higher than the top rate of income tax. I know in my own area, the previous administration of Renfrewshire Council introduced charges for transport for people with learning disabilities to daycare centres. This has now thankfully been reversed, but it did have a serious impact on a large number of vulnerable people within the community and emphasises the need for a consistent approach right across the country that places the needs of people with a disability or learning disability at the centre. I agree with the strategy when it states that the key to delivering effective services is to ensure that people are provided with the outcomes that they need at the right time and in the right place. We know a range of public bodies are involved in delivering services that people with learning disabilities need. We should, of course, be encouraging local authorities, health boards and colleges, for example, to work together to achieve the kind of joined-up approach that benefits people. But we should also be encouraging public bodies to do this in conjunction with people with learning disabilities. As Inclusion Scotland said prior to this... Yes, certainly.
Stuart Stevenson.
I'm very much in tune with what the member says and about the needs of people with learning disabilities. Will he also agree, however, that it's important that those who have learning disabilities actually have choice, as well as other people simply deciding what their needs are? I expect him to be able to agree.
Neil Baby.
I think, as I've been saying, and we'll go on to say, I think that people with learning disabilities should be involved and consulted on their services, and I think that's a crucial point. And this should be, the approach to joined-up services should be done in conjunction with people with learning disabilities. And as Inclusion Scotland said prior to this debate, if learning disabled people are to be at the heart of the commissioning process, then they must be involved in it. So I think that makes Stuart Stevenson's point there. Presiding Officer, adults with learning disabilities should have the opportunity to learn at college. This opportunity, unfortunately, has been taken away from hundreds of people in Scotland. The Scottish Consortium for Learning Disability published a report in August which estimated that around just 9% of people with learning disabilities attended further education colleges in 2012. That's a fall of nearly 300 people compared with the previous year, down from 2,696 to 2,407. It's clear there are significantly fewer courses for people with learning disabilities than there were just a few years ago. This is just one of the elements of the human cost this government's cuts to colleges are having. A Scottish Consortium for Learning Disability study from last year showed that there had been a 34% cut in part-time places for students with learning disabilities from 2,155 to 1,413. In addition, figures from the same organisation for 2012 show that the number of adults with learning disabilities who attend college for 2.5 days or less per week is down 20% on 2011. No surprise when you consider the drastic reduction in the number of part-time courses. And it's not just the Scottish Consortium for Learning Disability. A 2012 survey of Scotland's colleges by Enable Scotland found that courses for people with additional support needs have been halved since 2007, with a 46% cut in the last 2 years and a 42% cut in the last year. And the number of staff teaching people with additional support needs has been cut by 16% in the last 2 years. The Scottish Government strategy paper suggests that people with learning disabilities should be included in mainstream further education classes. The argument is made that it would give them greater access to award-bearing courses and improve employment prospects. However, what this fails to acknowledge is that these people are with additional support needs. While some may be able to cope with mainstream classes and benefit from the opportunity, there are others for whom mainstream classes would be a route to failure, lowering self-esteem and perhaps causing further retreat from mainstream life. So any efforts to encourage people with learning disabilities into mainstream classes must be matched with a commitment to provide them with the additional support they need. Otherwise, the disproportionate impact that college cuts have had on people with additional support needs will only get worse. It's clear that people with learning disabilities are suffering as a result of the Scottish Government's decisions to slash college budgets. People with learning disabilities are not getting the opportunity and specialist assistance to learn. And as a result of that, the Scottish Government is preventing them from accessing skills and qualifications they may need to get and hold down a job. It's concerning that the Minister mentioned employment figures earlier. It is concerning that figures show an increase in number of adults with learning disabilities are failing to secure employment. In 2012, 3,393 adults were recorded as employment or training for employment. This is just 13% of all adults with learning disabilities known to local authorities and represents a decrease of 653, that's 16% compared to 2011. Meanwhile, 55% are neither in employment or training for employment. Is it any wonder if we are cutting their college courses? We should obviously commend the good work that organisations do to help with supported employment, and we should encourage more such initiatives, but we are undermining that with the approach to colleges. And one final thing I would say, Presiding Officer, can I say that I believe the high proportion of people with learning disabilities and learning disabilities are affected by the bedroom tax and other iniquitous welfare reforms. It means it is essential the Scottish Government used their powers to act to negate the bedroom tax. Jackie Baillie was right when she said a UK Labour government would reverse the bedroom tax, and as we speak, Ed Miliband will be reaffirming that commitment. The Scottish Government has already found £20 million and it should commit to finding the other £30 million. There is nothing outlined in next year's budget to support the vulnerable individuals and families affected, as John Swinney keeps people on the hook before next year's referendum. The Scottish Government should also support our plans to legislate to prevent evictions as a result of the bedroom tax. The people affected, the people we are here to represent, need and deserve action from the Scottish Government. Presiding Officer, Scottish Labour welcomes the publication of the Keys to Life strategy paper. We are pleased it maintains the underlying principles of the previous strategy and of course supports its aim to improve the lives of people with learning disabilities. However, for people with learning disabilities to see and genuinely benefit, we need more than a strategy that simply sounds good on paper. We also need action to tackle the disproportionate effect that welfare cuts and cuts to colleges are having on people with disabilities and learning disabilities. Progress has been made, but there is more we can and should be doing to ensure people with learning disabilities have the support and opportunities they need to a quality of life they deserve. I move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. Before I call Mary Scanlon, can I just remind members if they wish to contribute to the debate, they should press the request to speak buttons, please. And I now call on Mary Scanlon to speak to and move Amendment 7787.1. 7 minutes or so, Mrs Scanlon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We welcome this debate on the new Learning Disabilities Strategy, and we agree and will be supporting the Government motion today. And if I can just take a quote from it, that Scotland can be proud of some of the changes in the quality of life for people with learning disabilities, but accepts that there is still much more to do. So we very much commend the honest appraisal of where we are in terms of help and support for people with learning disabilities. And I would also thank the Government for supporting our amendment, which was put forward in a constructive manner. I also welcome the Minister's focus on general health as well as the actual learning disabilities. But, Presiding Officer, in the first Parliament, along with many others, I warmly welcomed the publication The Same as You. In fact, it's been quoted several times in this chamber over the years, so it's now very welcome that we appraise where we are, what has been achieved, and we consider what still needs to be done. In fact, in the last 14 years, I think I've said a few times of all the Scottish Executive's glossy documents in the first 8 years, there's no doubt that the Same As You was definitely the best. But in preparation for this debate, I got out a copy of the Same As You document, then started reading the Keys to Life strategy, as well as all the other briefings that we all receive in advance of these debates. And before long, I found several strands of work by the Scottish Consortium on Learning Disability and several others. And although a significant amount of work came out of the strategy, I found it difficult to get an overview of exactly where we were. And then I thought about Bunty MacDonald, who has given permission for her name to be used today. Bunty MacDonald from Carbridge has been caring for her son, Craig, who has profound and complex learning disabilities and is now over 20 years old. As Fergus Ewing also knows, Bunty is a prolific campaigner and, in her own words, has had to fight every inch of the way to get appropriate help, support and respite for Craig. And I'm very pleased to tell the Minister that Bunty also agrees with the Government motion, but she asked me to highlight the 3 areas stated in my amendment today, which I hope will be supported across the Chamber. As Neil Bibby said, there are about 16,000 school children and young people in Scotland with learning disabilities and about 26,000 adults with learning disabilities in need of support. And according to Inclusion Scotland, the proportion of learning disabled people in employment has fallen significantly over recent years, and by 2010-11, only 1 in 15 adults with learning disabilities was reported to be in some form of paid employment. 1 in 15, and yet 2 out of 3 learning disabled people want to work. Another recent report on modern apprentices in Scotland revealed that of the 26,500 people who started a modern apprenticeship in 2011-12, only 74, 0.3%, were disabled or had learning difficulties. And I do feel this area could be focused on, prioritised and improved. The Minister also mentioned the transition from child to adult services, which I understand should take place at age 14. I am told from Bunty and others that this change leaves parents with considerable uncertainty and much worry about the future of their child. But that's bad enough, but it seems to be the process of finding something when they leave school at 19 is fraught with uncertainty. At this stage, they should be allocated a young adult social worker who will work with the parents and the person with learning disabilities to look into what is available and what is appropriate and discuss it with the family so that there is a transition and a plan to move forward after school. I'm aware that there are many social enterprises and charities doing excellent work in employing and training people with disabilities in secure employment. The Shetland Soap Company is an excellent example of such a company. And the strategy we are discussing today states we want to help young people with disabilities plan for leaving school and will work with local authorities, skills development and the Transitions Forum. So again, I would look forward to better joint working in order to improve this transition phase. Malcolm Chisholm chaired a group last week on, he's in the chamber, the Mental Health Cross-Party Group on bipolar. And we heard from many people about the years that it took in order to get a diagnosis. And again, as mental health is mentioned, I would say if people are given the diagnosis as early as possible, the support and the treatment as early as possible, not only does that help people remain in the work that they're in, but it can also help people to find work for the future. Recommendation 3 in the Same As You states that everyone with a learning disability who wants to should be able to have a personal life plan. Well, according to Bunty, they've never had one. But the personal life plan is not only essential in setting out the person's assessed care needs, but also the general health needs. But the recommendation also includes the annual review for people with more complex needs living at home. And yet, out of the total of 42,000 people in Scotland with a learning disability, around 13,000 had a personal life plan in 2011. It may be that some chose not to have one, but that's around 30%, and I do ask if this could also be improved on. And then I would like to point to recommendation 26, which states life plans for people with learning disabilities who live with their parents should include plans for a time when parents may no longer be able to provide care. And when I looked at the survey by Enable Scotland, entitled How Is It Going?, a survey of 21 to 64-year-olds, they found that by far the biggest worry for those with learning disabilities and their parents was in fact the worry for the future, entitled The Death of Parents. And I think we don't like talking about that, but I do think it is an important issue in terms of a personal life plan. And the third point mentioned in the amendment is I understand that the time taken to achieve legal guardianship is up to 2 years, and I've heard for some people it can be even longer than 2 years. I didn't really have time to look into why there's such a delay, why it's such a protracted process, whether there are legal obstacles. I'm really not sure. But for many people, things have to go on hold until they get this legal guardianship, and 2 years does seem to be quite a long time. So I would also ask and hope that the government will look into this issue and see what can be done to reduce this long wait. So, Presiding Officer, I move the amendment in my name, and I would say that, not surprisingly, we will not be supporting the Labour amendment today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to the open debate. At this stage of the debate, we have a little bit of time in hand. Therefore, I can give all members up to 7 minutes, and I call on Bob Doris to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I welcome the publication of the Keys to Life strategy, the second 10-year strategy for tackling learning disabilities and making sure that independent living is at the heart of everything we do. It does, of course, build quite rightly on a relatively successful strategy commissioned by the previous executive, same as you. And I think it's worth putting on the record that that did see a move away from long stay beds with 1,000 less over the years, and it did see a move away from traditional day centres set up. And I welcome both those things, but I'm also heartened to hear the Minister say that there's still a role, an essential role for day centres in some circumstances. And indeed, in my experience, and I'll speak about it later, it might even be a desirable role in some circumstances. And I think it's key to put that on the record as well. So, whilst this second strategy has been a long time in the making, I think it was right to take the 2 years to evaluate the previous 10-year strategy and then to run that through the National Learning-Disabilities-Strategy group. So I think all stakeholders can rightfully say that they've been had a key partnership role in coming forward with this second 10-year strategy. I do want to focus on some of the health recommendations initially. I know the Learning Disability Alliance in their very helpful submission said that was the right thing to do as well, and I might refer that to some of that later if I have time. With a 20-year reduced life expectancy for adults with learning difficulties and many learning disabled individuals having complex learning needs and multi-morbidities, it's only right that that's a major focus to the strategy. But it's also quite right that we have to quantify the extent of the issue before we can actually really fully address what the issues and the barriers are. And that's why I welcome recommendations 9 to 12 rather, particularly the new heat target that's to be developed to identify and track just how the learning disabled are actually using the NHS. I think in a few years' time we'll actually say to ourselves, When were why were we ever at a stage where we never tracked that in the first place? It's clearly the right thing to do, not just to track it for the sake of it, but as the strategy makes clear, to identify trends and patterns, and I assume to identify areas where there's improvement to be needed as well, and to better understand key issues such as unnecessary deaths that still occur within the learning disabled communities. For me, perhaps most significantly, actually, within those recommendations I mentioned, is the attempt to identify and track the social work resources provided to the learning disabled using the unique NHS number that every individual who is learning disabled has, the same as the rest of us. I think that will be important, and I'll perhaps say a bit more about that later if I have time. But in terms of the broad thrust of the health improvements we seek to see in relation to oral health, of course, I commend that. In terms of epilepsy, greater access to specialist nurses at an appropriate time, of course, I'm going to welcome that. And greater access to neurological services, of course, I'm going to welcome that within it, should we make that a reality. And perhaps a real meaningful one will be the next time the GP's contract is reviewed, perhaps having a special indicator within that contract about how they deal with the learning disabled. And I think quite rightly we should say the greater advocacy needs that the learning disabled may have in accessing GPs and other services, and the greater time they may actually need with the GP themselves. So lots to welcome within the health aspect of that, I have to say. I'd also like to give a nod to Recommendation 7, which suggests joint commissioning plans between local authorities and NHS by 2015 to take account of the needs of people with learning disabilities. And it says within that recommendation, plans should maximise independence and control. That is clearly the direction of travel we want to see public policy go in to meet the needs of our learning disabled communities. I want to say concentrate a bit more now on recommendations in relation to, if you like, traditional social care and independent living aspirations. In doing so, I am, and members will probably predict, I'm going to mention Glasgow City Council's reform of day centres for the learning disabled. Could I couch that by saying that local authorities of all political persuasion have not always got this right? And this is not a party political attack, this is me representing constituents that I will defend, who I don't think have had their interests met. So could I perhaps look at Recommendation 5 within the Keys to Life? It says that in preparation for the legal duties imposed by the Social Care Self-Directed Support Scotland Act 2013, local authorities and their NHS partners should work with private, voluntary and third sector agencies to ensure that people with learning disabilities have access to a creative variety of providers and supports and are assisted to be to think creatively about how outcomes can be met and what assistance they may need to develop control. And I'll repeat that, assistance they may need to develop control. And please indulge me, because I want to also look at Recommendation 27, that by June 2018, the Scottish Government, in partnership with local authorities, the third sector and people with learning disabilities and carers, that get to review and further develop day opportunities. I'll repeat that again, I've missed out the second half of that for time constraints, but that people with learning disabilities and carers review and further develop day opportunities. In other words, as the Learning Disability Alliance puts it, if I can find the quote that they said, and I probably now can. Yes, there we are. It said it could be the recommendations could be strengthened from the start by re-emphasising the phrase "nothing about us without us" in terms of learning disabled. So it's through those very good principles included within the new strategy, but also a thread running through the previous strategies, that I look at Glasgow and look at the fact that they developed a plan to close 3 day centres for adults with learning disabilities, did not consult with them, presented the closure of 3 centres as a fait accompli and consulted on the alternatives after the day centres were closed. Well, I have to say, that's not about control, that's about marginalisation of some of the most vulnerable people in society, and it shouldn't be allowed. And I think that's where I want to re-stress that carers and adults with learning disabilities in Glasgow have said that they're open to reforming day centre provision and general learning disability provision within the city, but speak to them. A 2-year moratorium to allow them to engage positively with Glasgow City Council in order to map out the best service provision and support for adults with learning disabilities within the city. My final point, Presiding Officer, would be is what recourse do adults with learning disabilities have when councils get it wrong? There are statutory duties in terms of consultation if they decide to have consultation that councils have. But when they get it spectacularly wrong, such as they have done in Glasgow, and sometimes elsewhere as well, it's not just about Glasgow, how can these most vulnerable people that I seek to represent have recourse? So a fantastic 10-year strategy in front of us, but we should always be minded of where there's still gaps where we have to represent the most vulnerable people in our constituencies.
Thank you very much. Whilst I can be generous with 7-minute speeches, if members go much over that, then I'm afraid that will have to drop back down later in the debate. Malcolm Chisholm, to be followed by John McAlpine.
Presiding Officer, in welcoming this comprehensive learning disabilities strategy, I think we should also remember, as Mary Scanlon did, that great policy document from the early years of the Parliament, the same as you, completed with an exemplary consultation process, and for all of that I think we should be grateful to Ian Gray. I decided yesterday to do my own little consultation process on this via Facebook and Twitter, and did get some interesting responses. Brian Kavanagh, former Chair of Social Work in Lothian Region and a great champion of inclusive services for those with learning disabilities, came back: less strategies, more champions, and consistency of process that parents, carers and service users can rely on across Scotland. And I think consistency should be a very important word for the strategy. Sue Kelly, my constituent, came back with: give people with learning difficulties a voice and listen to what they have to say, give them the resources and the support they need to live independently. And again, I think independent living clearly has to be right at the heart of this strategy. But most of all, Leslie Montgomery, who has championed, my constituent Leslie Montgomery, who has championed integrated and inclusive services for people with learning disabilities for decades, came back with far more words than could be put on either Twitter or Facebook. She knows all about it because she had a daughter, Kimberly, with profound and multiple learning disabilities, who very sadly died 5 years ago. But just two of the things she said. Firstly, she feels that there is still too much about day centres, and this she would disagree with Bob Doris, too much emphasis on day centres rather than living in the community with more stimulation and inclusion. And she's always championed integration both in schools and in the community. But our second big interest in terms of her comments related to her experience of often looking after her daughter Kimberly when she had to go into hospital. She is concerned that there is still too much acceptance of invasive feeding, which she never liked. She always made sure she was beside her daughter as much as possible in hospital, helping to feed her. But she also says that she actually had to guard her daughter. This is 5 and more years ago, so we hope it has moved on, in the sense that she had to make sure she wasn't neglected and had to make sure that the positive things that her daughter needed were actually done. And she gave me, I know I shouldn't hold things up really in the chamber, the personal passport of her daughter. She carried this every time her daughter went into hospital. And it's very comprehensive information about her daughter, which was available to all healthcare professionals whenever she went into hospital. And I think that's actually a good idea. But I think probably things have moved on, because there are a lot of positive developments, many of which she praised, having read the strategy. In relation to health, the Minister mentioned the collaborative. I always support collaboratives. I hope good things will come out of that. The Learning Disability Observatory sounds a very positive development, and also many specific recommendations, such as the one about epilepsy that Bob Doris mentioned, and access, that's recommendation 19, about access to specialist neurological services. So I think things are getting better, but we certainly can never be in this or in any other area complacent. I mean, the last thing I would say specifically about health is I hope the government will work with the third sector. I know that Bowel Cancer UK have had a great initiative around bowel screening for people with learning disabilities, and I know they want to work with the government on that, and I hope that offer is being taken up. But moving on from health to health and social care, clearly there are big opportunities there, and we're currently considering the bill in the Health Committee. I found the Inclusion Scotland briefing very useful. They suggest we should strengthen recommendation 5 so that people with learning disability and their carers are involved in commissioning, rather than just account being taken of their views. So I think that's an important theme actually that's coming through a lot of the evidence to the Health Committee. I give way.
Bob Doris.
Malcolm Chisholm for giving way. I was going to intervene earlier, but I didn't want to interrupt. You were telling constituent story, and I wanted to kind of let you finish that. I agree with you about the kind of co-production and commissioning model where carers and service users, learning disabled, should be at the heart of it. You did give reference to day centres earlier in your speech. I'm not wed to a day centre model, but would the member agree with me that the principle is choice and control, and if some adults make positive choices to use day centres, those should be afforded to them?
Malcolm Chisholm.
Well, I'm sure I'm not really wishing to enter into that controversy. I was merely giving the views of my constituent. And I think the general thrust of policy has been towards more integration and inclusion. But clearly, central to all of this always has to be the views of people with learning disabilities. And I wouldn't disagree with what Doris says about that in general terms. Now, I had a bit more I was going to say. I better move on since we haven't got indefinite amounts of time. So I really wanted to say a bit about independent living, but particularly advocacy, because I think that is really central to independent living. So for the last couple of minutes, if you would just let me say something about that, not least because I've just put down a motion about this, which I hope everybody will sign, and Jim Eady there is having a reception or an event or meeting on Thursday lunchtime with the Independent Advocacy Alliance, which again I hope members will go to. So the Chamber will be aware of the publication of the Scottish Independent Advocacy Alliance's report on the history and future of advocacy in Scotland. If you're not aware of it, you will be once you've signed my motion. Under the Mental Health Care and Treatment Scotland Act, people with learning disabilities and people with a mental illness have a right to independent advocacy. It plays a key role in enabling the most vulnerable members of society to lead fuller and more independent lives. Within the context of this debate, independent advocacy is a crucial element of safeguarding and progressing civil and human rights and of implementing the social justice agenda. It supports person-centred services, helps to avoid or resolve crisis situations, and is effective in helping move people's lives forwards. Commissioners must be open to partnership working together to properly assess the number of residents eligible for this kind of support. As pointed out in the Keys to Life report, health and social care partnerships must gather robust information on unmet eligible need and then ensure that tailored services are provided to best address individual need. Independent advocacy can then act as a route for those who have difficulties in communicating these needs to access the services that create a more independent future. Having Your Say was a 2006 report produced by the advocacy subgroup of the Same As You National Implementation Group. The report heavily recommended that the Scottish Government should continue to encourage the development of local independent advocacy services as a matter of priority. So I have some concern that recommendation 32 is only talking about this being carried forward by 2018. There is a statutory obligation under the Mental Health Act. So I hope ensuring that everyone who needs and requires and wants services, advocacy services with a learning disability will be able to access those services as soon as possible.
Many thanks. I now call Joan McAlpine to be followed by Stuart Maxwell.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to speak today in the debate as the subject of learning disability is of considerable personal interest to me, as I have a younger sister with Down syndrome who uses the services and who will be impacted by the new strategy. I welcome the Keys to Life strategy, and I particularly welcome that it's the second learning disability strategy of this Parliament, which I think demonstrates the progressive nature of our Scottish Parliament. The strategy, as others have mentioned, focuses on health and well-being of people with learning disabilities, and I want to address that directly also. But before I do that, I just wanted to address the Labour amendment and some of the comments made by Mr Bibby about college places and college education for people with learning disabilities, as it's something that I've been involved in discussions with both Enable and the Cabinet Secretary for Education about. Certainly there were genuine concerns about a diminution of college places for people with learning disabilities. But on the other hand, the learning disabled charities and advocates were also critical of some of the types of courses that were being provided in colleges for people with learning disabilities. The outcomes weren't particularly good, and the phrase revolving door was often used. So, as a result of this issue being raised in Parliament before, I arranged for Enable to meet the Cabinet Secretary and a very successful meeting went ahead in March this year, where the Cabinet Secretary agreed to fund the Scottish Consortium of Learning Disabilities and Enable to do a joint piece of work on developing a guidance document for FE colleges, because I think it's important to remember that these decisions were made at college level before college reform. And at that meeting, it was also agreed to support the rollout of Enable Scotland's transition to employment model over the academic year 2013-14. And only this morning I got an email from Jan Savage from Enable to say, I thought you might like an update on the further education project we've been working on to further the Cabinet Secretary's announcement. And we've agreed partnerships with 7 further education colleges, Borders, Kilmarnock, West Lothian, Perth, Aberdeen, Dundee and Forth Valley, and are ready to deliver the Transitions to Employment programme. They just need to get that passed by the Scottish Funding Council. So I think it's important that, there have been difficulties at a college level, and we mustn't take our eye off the ball on that. But I think it's important to acknowledge that these issues have been addressed by the government and that progress is being made.
Jackie Bailey.
Very much welcome the Transitions to Employment project. I think there is no difference between us on that front, because it does ensure that more people have positive outcomes. But would she nevertheless accept that there actually are fewer places, there's less money going in, and actually potentially if we use that money to fund more of the Transition to Employment project, we would get better outcomes. So it's not either or, we really need both.
Joan McAlpine.
Well, £250 million is a significant sum of money, and I think it's important that the Cabinet Secretary has listened to what Enable and Scottish Consortium are saying, and is actually providing improved quality to the courses. And again, colleges have an obligation to deliver equality outcomes, and so really if colleges aren't doing that, then the Scottish Funding Council should be alerted to that, because everyone is entitled to an education. In terms of the strategy, the Keys to Life, I wanted to address particularly what the very alarming statistic that people with learning disabilities live 20 years on average less than the general population. And I particularly welcome recommendation 11, which investigates the reasons, which instructs the Scottish Learning Disabilities Observatory to develop a better understanding of the causes of those unnecessary deaths. Of course, the reasons for early death are complex. People with learning disabilities can have very serious congenital heart disease, for example, thyroid problems. And in addition to major health challenges, learning disabled people may not in the past have received the treatment they needed to address relatively minor health problems, and as a result they can become major health problems. And that can be partly explained by the difficulty in getting them the specialised treatment that they need. For example, how do you take blood from someone who you suspect is anaemic or suffering from some other condition if they're petrified of needles and lack the capacity to rationalise the need to give blood? And what do you do if a person needs an operation to improve the quality of their life but is phobic about hospitals? How do you reassure a person who has difficulty in communicating their fears or describing their symptoms? I've got experience of families suffering from these sorts of problems, and 20 years ago there was absolutely nothing that was done. These families were very isolated and marginalised. Now we have specialist community learning disability teams who have made enormous difference to the healthcare of this section of the population, and I think that's as a result of the previous strategy. And I'd just like to use the opportunity to praise the Inverclyde Community Learning Disability team that I have direct experience of at the Elizabeth Martin Clinic in Larkfield, who have made an enormous difference to the lives of the learning disabled people that they deal with. You'll have consultant psychiatrists working together with a psychologist, community nurses, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, speech and language therapy, counsellors, multidisciplinary social workers, dietitians and chiropodists. And I think it's very important that people with learning disabilities have access to familiar professionals and a continuity in their care, and also a holistic approach. It's a slow process delivering medical care to some people with learning disabilities. It requires enormous amounts of patience, understanding and flexibility on the part of health professionals. If I could just give a personal example of one learning disabled person I know who broke her foot and had to have a plaster removed. But the traditional way of doing that is to go to a hospital and have the stookie, to use a good Glasgow word, sewn off. That would be absolutely terrifying for this individual. But because of the flexibility and support delivered by the specialist nurse and the specialist physiotherapist, the team were able to be flexible and remove the plaster in a different way in the home. So that's just one example of some of the advances that have been made. And also, I'm now running out of time because I've diverted into colleges. So I just wanted to I also wanted to draw attention to the GP contract. I think it's very important, given the communication difficulties that some people with learning disabilities have, that they get longer GP appointments. And I wanted to praise that particular recommendation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now call Stuart Maxwell to be followed by Margaret McCulloch.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. May I begin by thanking everyone who has been involved in developing the new Learning Disability Strategy, The Keys to Life, and in particular thank the citizens of Scotland who have a learning disability, who I know have been at the heart of its development. While our main focus here today is to debate this new strategy, I first want to contextualise what it means to be a Scottish citizen and have a learning disability. The exact number of people with learning disabilities in Scotland is in fact unknown. Published statistics, however, estimate approximately 16,000 school-aged children and young people and 26,000 adults have a learning disability and require support. Our population of citizens with learning disabilities are not a homogeneous group. Some people with learning disabilities will require just a little support, while others with more complex needs will rely entirely on family members and paid carers for all aspects of daily life. What is true, however, is that every person with a learning disability is an individual. Like you and me, individuals with hopes, aspirations, dreams and rights. We, as is the case with many nations, have a shameful history of policy and law which aim to reduce the social problem of learning disability through segregation, isolation and, unthinkably today, sterilisation. Finding a solution to the historically viewed burden of people with learning disabilities has led us from the unacceptable place of segregation in the earlier part of the 20th century through to recent manifestations of community care and eventually to here today, where citizens with learning disabilities have the right to individualised budgets and personalised support. We have much to welcome with this new learning disability strategy. We, of course, believe that every citizen has the right to live longer, healthier lives. I believe that providing person-centred, safe and compassionate care that protects individual rights and empowers independence is a fundamental duty of our society, our services and indeed our government. That is why I firmly support this new strategy, a strategy that does not purport that all is well, but acknowledges both the distance we have come since the publication of the first learning disabilities policy in Scotland, the same as you, and I must at this point heap praise, I think, on the previous executive for the work it did in bringing that first strategy forward, but of course, and importantly, where our collective journey should take us to in the future. This strategy acknowledges that many people with learning disabilities would like to work, live independently, have meaningful relationships, a home of their own, and feel safe within their communities. Yet almost 9,000 adults with learning disabilities in Scotland live with a family carer, 14% of whom live with a family carer aged over 50. Less than 1 in 20 adults with a learning disability is in any form of paid work. And research has shown that 2 out of every 5 children born to parents with learning disabilities are permanently removed from their care. Now, I mentioned this earlier in the intervention to the Minister. The Education Committee report that was published yesterday showed or provided some evidence from learning disabled parents and their desire, their absolute desire, that they should be treated as individuals, that their cases should be treated on a case-by-case basis. And the fact that around 40% of their children are removed permanently, they felt, and I think they have some justification in this, that that wasn't what was happening in the normal day-to-day run of things. So I think there is much work that still has to be done. However, the Social Care Self-Directed Support Scotland Act 2013, introduced earlier this year, will empower individuals to have greater control over decisions affecting their lives. including the support required to live as independent, safe and meaningful lives as possible. Now, I said earlier that the exact number of people with learning disabilities in Scotland is unknown. I would now like to turn my attention to this and to the main body of this new strategy, health inequalities. I have read with dismay the early mortality statistics for people with learning disabilities that other members have mentioned. Some reports from England suggesting that men die up to 13 years earlier and women up to 20 years earlier. Importantly, most of these deaths were unexpected, premature and indeed avoidable. I am also aware of a number of fatal accident inquiries in Scotland, the determinations of which would support these findings. This is simply unacceptable, and it's why I wholeheartedly endorse the strategy's recommendations, which aim to understand the causes of such unacceptable early mortality rates and those which place a duty on local NHS partners to implement change. We have moved from our shameful position of out-of-sight, out-of-mind services to provisions of one of inclusion and, I hope, individuality. But have we really done that? People with learning disabilities remain invisible in our routinely collected health data. We are unable to measure, trend or predict the health of our citizens with learning disabilities. That's why I welcome very much, I warmly endorse, in fact, the creation of the Scottish Learning Disability Observatory and eagerly await the outputs of the Observatory. It should provide us with the evidence and, I believe, the information required for us to take further action to right this unacceptable position. This strategy also acknowledges the differences between Scotland's general population and people with learning disabilities in terms of health presentations. It acknowledges the difference in the leading cause of death and in cancer presentations. It acknowledges that public health measures for all citizens of Scotland, developed with the best of intentions, can in fact widen the health inequality gap for citizens who have a learning disability. Again, I warmly welcome those recommendations which seek to address this matter. In particular, those recommendations that seek to develop a heat target for our NHS to ensure people with learning disabilities are visible in routinely collected data, and importantly, as others have mentioned, how our new GP contract in Scotland will best meet the needs of our citizens who have a learning disability. This new strategy further acknowledges that people with learning disabilities have the right to access the full range of services that all citizens of Scotland access. It also rightly acknowledges that from time to time, some people with a learning disability will require reasonable adjustments, including access to specialist support, to enable them to access mainstream services. Citizens of Scotland who have a learning disability have the right to safe, effective and person-centred healthcare. We have the responsibility to ensure this is delivered every time. The citizens of Scotland who have a learning disability have the right to work, and we have the responsibility to ensure that that is what happens. The citizens of Scotland who have a learning disability have the right to affordable housing and the right to support. We have the responsibility to ensure that that is what is delivered. And the citizens of Scotland who have a learning disability have the right to feel safe. We have the responsibility to ensure that this happens not just some of the time, but all of the time. I very much welcome this new learning disability strategy and look forward to every citizen with learning disabilities in Scotland being given the keys to their lives.
Many thanks. I now call Margaret McCulloch to be followed by Dennis Robertson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This Parliament and this country has a strong track record of promoting social inclusion, diversity and equality of opportunity. The European Convention of Human Rights has been woven into the very fabric of devolution, having been given a real legal force by the Scotland Act and the Human Rights Act. We all aspire to become a better and more inclusive nation. From education to employment to every other aspect of life, we want people with learning disabilities to be just as included as everyone else in society. Last week's debate on disabled people in politics reminded us that we still have some way to go if we are to meet those aspirations. So too does the ongoing debate about welfare reform, but we're making progress. Attitudes are changing. As the Minister said in his foreword to the new strategy, people with learning disabilities themselves believe that they are more accepted and valued in their communities. With this strategy, we have to build on the good work that has been done since devolution and bring the Parliament closer to meeting the aspirations we share for people with learning disabilities. The first years of this Parliament saw, the same as you published, It was the first major policy review looking at learning disabilities, and it was a comprehensive, well-received document. Crucially, it approached the issues faced by people with learning disabilities as right-based issues. This acknowledged in both the current document and in the Scottish Consortium of Learning Disabilities evaluation of the original strategy. Let me be clear, a rights-based approach was right then and it's right now. A continuation of that approach is to be welcomed from across the chamber. The other instance where there has been welcome continuity is in the scope of the strategy, because it covers the whole lifespan of the individual. From 16,000 children and school-aged young people with learning disabilities to 26,000 adults and more adults who may no longer self-define as disabled, this strategy must be there from birth to old age. For people of all ages and from every generation, the ambitions and the policies set out in this document have to reflect and speak to the needs, the hopes and the rights of this diverse group. The fundamentals behind this strategy are sound, but as Rachel Lenone from Down Syndrome Scotland says in The Scotsman just the other week, the devil is in the detail. Specifically, it is in the implementation. How will the objectives set out in what is undoubtedly a substantive document be turned into a reality by the Scottish Government, public bodies, local authorities and the third sector? I recognise that COSLA, the NHS, the third sector and others have been partners in the development of this strategy, and their ongoing partnership is absolutely critical as we take this agenda forward. But we cannot ignore the context in which this strategy has been developed and in which it must now be implemented. Every one of those partners face huge pressures in their budgets, and there are wider changes too. Self-directed support, integration of health and social care, welfare reform. The background to this strategy is different from the original. Some of those changes, I think, will prove to be positive, while others, such as welfare cuts, will not. But I hope we would all agree that as we consider each of the 50+ recommendations that have been made, we have to be mindful of the pace of reform, and we have to make sure that we do not lose sight of the individual person or their rights. The final point I would make is about the welcome focus on the health of people with learning disabilities in this strategy. People with learning disabilities are over 20 times more likely to suffer from epilepsy. People with learning disabilities are more likely to experience illness, which may require hospitalisation and may in turn experience delayed discharge. People with Down syndromes are particularly susceptible to hypothyroidism as they get older. The needs of people with learning disabilities can be complex and diverse, as there are added challenges for those who may not be able to articulate their health complaints. I would therefore stress the importance of the NHS understanding learning disabilities as well as independent advocacy to help people with disabilities in their interaction with public services. Even in these tough times, we should aim to develop a more person-centred service for this section of the population through understanding and communication. Presiding Officer, the needs of people with learning disabilities are multifaceted, and the inequalities that they face are really one-dimensional. This strategy sets out a number of ways in which we can address those needs, building the rights-based approach that has informed so much of this work since devolution, and improve the quality of life of tens of thousands of people with learning disabilities all across Scotland. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call Dennis Robertson to be followed by Jim Eadie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. When you extended the time to 7 minutes, I put my hand in my pocket, took out my throat lozenges and certainly hope that I can attain 6. Presiding Officer, this is a very important debate, and it is about people. It is about individuals. We collectively refer in a generic sense to people with learning disabilities. The spectrum of the learning disability is vast. And I want to touch on one or two aspects of people and individuals with learning disabilities. First of all, I'd like to come to the recommendation, and that is Recommendation 1. Recommendation 1 basically looks at the impact assessment, looking at dignity, equality, non-discrimination. I think if I was writing that particular recommendation, I would also include respect. And the reason for that, Presiding Officer, is we need to ensure that we are respectful to those with learning disabilities. We should be respectful in drawing up the strategy with those with learning disabilities, because it's not about creating a society for people with learning disabilities. It's creating a society where they are part of, they are an integral part of. They should be shaping their future. It's all very well that we sit down sometimes and maybe articulate on behalf of, and that is sometimes right and proper, because sometimes people with learning disabilities may not be able to articulate exactly what they want because of their difficulty in communication. But in the simplistic aspect of trying to create a society for people, individuals, and Mary Scanlon was talking about, person-centred care, etc. And we should always ensure that when there's a single shared assessment, there's a care plan, individual care plan for that person, for that individual. We are looking at that person living in our society, living in our community, being part of. Yes, there will be supports needed. Yes, there will be an infrastructure. Yes, we will have to ensure that there is a structure in place to ensure equality. Stuart Maxwell said that in terms of the collection of data, is quite often the person with a learning disability is invisible within that collection of data. That should not be right. It cannot be right. And what I would say to the Minister is, when we're collecting the data, whatever is the correct term, is we need to ensure that we're not just saying, here we have a person with a learning disability. We need to ensure that we're saying, this is a person, either black, ethnic minority person with a learning disability. This is a person with a sensory impairment with a learning disability. This is a person with whatever condition with a learning disability. We need to ensure that we cross-reference. We need to ensure that we collect the information that is going to be important in informing and ensuring that we develop the society that we need for our people with learning disabilities. I remember many years ago, Presiding Officer, working with a young lad in Inverclyde in my days as a very young social worker, because I was a very young social worker when I was in Inverclyde. But Presiding Officer, this young lad was lashing out. This young lad, every time he went out to his day centre, was abusive. He was physically abusive. He was kicking, he was biting, he was punching. And do you know why? His shoes were too tight. He couldn't communicate that when people put his shoes on, they hurt. They were hurting him. He didn't have that ability to communicate through speech. But Presiding Officer, it was obvious. It was obvious for those that wanted to take the time and the care to look that every time he put a certain pair of shoes on, he had this reaction. It was simplistic. Presiding Officer, I commend the work being done by Optometry Scotland and opticians throughout Scotland at the moment, working in conjunction with RNIB, trying to ensure that those people with learning disabilities have their sight checked. Because what we found out is that over 11,000 people with learning disabilities have a sight impairment. Now, quite often, and this is very simple again, Presiding Officer, giving a person a corrective lens, giving them the spectacles to enable them to see clearly can impact immensely on their lives. We've actually found out that a person has actually been able to recognise a member of their family, a carer. They're actually recognise the food on their plate. They're recognising their favourite jumper. Why? Because they've been given the corrective lens that was needed. Something that hadn't been thought about. They hadn't thought about taking this individual to get their eyes tested. They just accepted they were knocking things over. They just accepted they were screwing their eyes up. They just accepted they weren't being able to recognise a member of their family. That can't be right. Sometimes we look for the complicated, Presiding Officer, when we should be looking at the simple, the most obvious. I welcome the strategies. I'm not sure that we need 52. In reading the document, I kept thinking to myself, did I read that earlier? Did I read that earlier? And I kept asking myself, it's not the quantity, it's the quality. And I'm hopeful that this government, and I sincerely hope that it's cross-party support across this chamber, that we will deliver a strategy, we will deliver a document, we will deliver for people and individuals with learning disabilities for Scotland at the end of the day. Because, presiding officer, it is about the individual, and that's what we should always focus on, that individual with their specific need. Thank you, presiding officer.
Many thanks. I now call on Jim Eadie to be followed by Ken McIntosh.
Thank you, presiding officer. I'm grateful for the opportunity to take part in this afternoon's debate and to follow what have been a number of very impressive contributions on the quality of life for people with learning disabilities. For most of us, learning is an essential part of life, but for many adults in Scotland, 27,000 of them to be exact, it is something which can be difficult, if not impossible. And that is because they have a learning disability. This is often a lifelong condition which starts before adulthood, and it can mean they need help and support to understand information, to learn new skills, and to cope with living independently. Dennis Sullivan, who just spoke so eloquently, reminded us that this debate is about individuals, it is about people. And unfortunately, at every stage of the lives of people with a learning disability, through to old age, they face discrimination and barriers which prevent them living their lives to the full. Margaret McCulloch spoke about the role that this Parliament has played in addressing social exclusion and how human rights is woven into the very fabric of this institution. The barriers which people face in their lives shouldn't and needn't exist. I firmly believe, and in this I know I am joined by my colleagues across this chamber, that society is judged on how it cares for its most vulnerable citizens. Surely those who have a learning disability should enjoy the same rights to employment, housing, education and healthcare as the rest of us. They should be at the heart of society, not outside it. Margaret McCulloch spoke about the European dimension, and that is also the belief of the United Nations. Its Declaration on the Rights of Disabled Persons makes the very point and says they must be given the chance to enjoy a decent life which is as normal and full as possible. Yet according to Enable Scotland, the country's largest voluntary organisation for people with learning disabilities, fewer than 1 in 20 people in this country in that category are in employment, although that figure does exclude those in sheltered workplaces such as Remploy. And there are a number of specific challenges around employment, so I was particularly pleased that the Minister addressed the collaborative work with Skills Development Scotland, NHS boards and local authorities, all of which is designed to meet these challenges. We can all agree with the aspiration and the ambition set out in this strategy that people with learning disabilities with appropriate support are able to work in mainstream employment suitable to their skills and capabilities. The strategy focuses on helping people with a learning disability enter mainstream employment wherever possible. That is surely the right approach, but there does continue to be a role for supported businesses, which is why I welcome the Scottish Government's independent review of Scotland's supported businesses. And I look forward to further action being taken to identify the obstacles and barriers these businesses face and the kind of support which they need to transition from an organisation which is dependent on grant funding to one which can grow and prosper as a commercial and viable business or social enterprise. A number of previous speakers have referred to the importance of education, and there are a number of examples of good practice which have been highlighted in the strategy. In Edinburgh, I'm aware of the work of Enable Scotland, who are delivering the Stepping Up programme in 5 schools across the city. These are Boroughmuir High, Tynecastle High, Leith Academy, Pilrig Park and Drummond Community High. And each year, Enable Scotland engage over 40 young people with learning disabilities from S4 to S6 in Edinburgh schools. And these young people are supported in developing the skills and confidence to make a successful transition from school into employment or training. Enable Scotland provide ongoing support to both trainees and employers to ensure their long-term success. And this is part of a nationwide schools programme funded by Inspiring Scotland that Enable Scotland have been delivering since 2009, and that has supported over 450 pupils who have learning disabilities to make a positive transition from school into employment, vocational training and apprenticeships. Scotland's colleges have been mentioned in the debate, and of course our colleges have a social obligation to the communities in which they operate. They have a duty to do all that they can to ensure that people with a learning disability can access educational opportunities and participate fully in society. I was pleased to secure a meeting last year with the Cabinet Secretary for Education, Michael Russell, and the charities Enable Scotland and the Learning Disability Alliance Scotland, representing people with learning disabilities. And along with my parliamentary colleagues, Jackie Bailey and Joan McAlpine, we discussed the provision of courses and student numbers across Scotland. And Joan McAlpine has mentioned the further discussions which she has been involved with, involving the Cabinet Secretary and those charities. And as a result of all of that activity, the Scottish Government has listened and has taken steps to ensure that the outcome agreements of colleges reflect the needs of people with a learning disability. And this is being backed with additional resources. Bob Doris and Stuart Maxwell emphasised the importance of gathering good data and measuring trends on unnecessary deaths, on health outcomes and even the allocation of social work resources. Bob Doris spoke about including an indicator within the GP contract, and Joan McAlpine spoke of the need for longer appointments for people with a learning disability, and I hope that the Minister will take on board both of those constructive suggestions. Enable Scotland, in respect of the collection of data, have said in a briefing to members that this represents a clear opportunity, and they state, "We are hopeful that the Scottish Government and other partners will capitalise on this opportunity to support the monitoring of the achievement of the objectives of the Keys to Life." We can all endorse that. Malcolm Chisholm spoke about the important role of independent advocacy services, but I would echo his concern that 2018 does appear, at least on first glance, a very long-term timescale for agreeing an action plan involving all of the key stakeholders and the Independent Advocacy Alliance. I also welcome his advertisement for the event that I will be hosting in the Parliament on Thursday of this week. Presiding Officer, no political party has a monopoly of concern for people with learning disabilities, and no government of any political complexion either in Scotland or in the UK, has frankly done enough to address the needs and concerns of this important and marginalised group. I welcome the leadership which the Minister is providing. I wholeheartedly support this strategy, and I look forward to further action on behalf of people with learning disabilities.
Many thanks. Now call on Ken McIntosh to be followed by George Adam. 7 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It doesn't quite seem like 13 years have passed since the last time we discussed a strategy to support people with learning disabilities, although I will admit the point was brought home to me when looking back through the notes or the minutes of the Education Committee and our inquiry into special needs from that time. I discovered that Fiona MacLeod and I are the only two members of that particular committee still here. And in fact, when I read the 2001 report, I saw that another parliamentary colleague, Ian Gray, the Minister responsible for bringing forward the same as you, he noted at the time that it had been in turn 20 years since the previous strategy had been published and that little progress had been made since then. Now, the good news, and the reason I believe it doesn't feel like 13 years since the same as you, is that we have moved forward. There is a far more inclusive approach to our education system and from employers across the country, and there's a much greater focus on giving people the resources and the support to get on in mainstream activities. Perhaps most important of all, the concept of long-stay hospitals for people with learning disabilities is behind us, a point I think Bob Doris made earlier. However, in other ways, I think it's also fair to say the change has been less groundbreaking than we would have liked, and some of the same challenges highlighted then are still with us. How to give people with learning disabilities a voice in choosing their own future and greater access to mainstream services, the point that Stuart Stevenson made. how to reduce the conflict or tension between families struggling to cope on the one hand and the public authorities struggling to meet their needs whilst balancing the books on the other, how to help those with additional needs improve themselves through access to continuous education, and how to have clearer lines of coordination between services and to provide the physical support to make inclusion a reality. Let me say firstly that the report we are debating today is an excellent document and one that has already been warmly welcomed by those with a learning disability and the many hundreds of organisations working with them. It's particularly useful because throughout it there is a clear recognition of the need for joined-up solutions, something we are often calling for as politicians but rarely figure out how to deliver. But crucially, Presiding Officer, strategy will only take us so far unless the resources backing it up are aligned and all levels of the process are working towards the same goals. I think across this chamber we share a noble ambition for children to be educated in the environment, be it mainstream or specialist, that suits them. It may not take very much support for a young person to thrive in a mainstream setting with all the benefits that brings. However, when that support is not in place, it can become impossible to cope with that environment. Enable Scotland tells us in their briefing that people with learning disabilities are perhaps the most marginalised and socially excluded group in our society. One area where children must feel completely isolated is where help with communication difficulties is not available. A constituent recently contacted me about her daughter who has a neurological disorder called Rett syndrome. She has struggled for many years to get the support with communication she requires, something which is particularly frustrating because it turns out this young girl is cognitively much more able than any of her doctors originally suspected. She is able to communicate and has demonstrated an ability to make progress in literacy and numeracy. However, she is unable to make the best use of the resources available because she doesn't have access to enough speech and language therapy. The Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists estimated just last year that 250,000 Scottish children, young people and adults have speech, language and communication needs. So based on the numbers of speech and language therapists in Scotland, we can work out that there are 262 people with a speech and language need for every speech and language therapist in Scotland. And just to, if I may, quote my constituent to demonstrate what this means again, my constituent writes that, alas, her daughter is not alone. Her story is typical. My constituent describes, she goes on to say, her daughter's special needs school has a roll of just over 100. The great majority of the pupils at the school require speech and language therapy support at some level. There are 2 speech and language therapists allocated to the school, but they only attend once a week. That means that ultimately no one is receiving any input from them. The caseload is simply too big. And Presiding Officer, this is not just a loss to each individual affected or held back from making the most of their potential. We are all, both socially and economically, the poorer for it. A recent study of unemployed young males found that over 88% were described as language impaired, compared to just 1% of the UK general population. I think this is a point the Minister and I think Mary Scanlon also made, that people with learning disabilities want to work. Now, the strategy before us today mentions communication 35 times, but it doesn't give a recommendation on how to improve the provision of speech and language support for people with learning disabilities. And I'd be interested to know what more the Scottish Government can do to support these young people. Presiding Officer, I want to move on to another point mentioned by colleagues, and that is to pick up on one area where, quite simply, the strategy the Scottish Government espouses is at odds with reality. And I'm grateful to Enable Scotland, who noted some figures that would shock all of us who believe in further education being open to all. Courses for people with additional support needs have been halved since 2007-2008. The biggest cuts have been in the last 2 years, with a 46% cut. The amount of staff teaching people with additional support needs has been cut by 16% in the last 2 years, and the number of adults with learning disabilities attending further education for 2.5 days per week or fewer has fallen by almost 20% in the last year alone. Presiding Officer, just last week, this was an issue raised at the cross-party group on colleges and universities, and I'm conscious, Presiding Officer, that one of the phrases de nos jours is that those with the broadest shoulders should bear the greatest burden. It's an expression I've heard from the First Minister, the Prime Minister, from leading figures in my own party, and in every case, I do not doubt the genuine intent. But the reality is that it's not the most resilient, but the most vulnerable who bear the greatest burden of the economic difficulties, of the welfare reforms and of the educational cuts. It's those with learning difficulties who are displaced by greater levels of unemployment and underemployment, and it is courses for those with additional needs, which have been disproportionately cut. Now, I am proud of the fact that through years of expansion and growth, this Parliament has improved services and reformed attitudes to people with learning disabilities. But the real test is how we respond and protect those gains at times of difficulty. And, Presiding Officer, I'd like to end on a positive, if I may, and that's to take an example both from Jamedia and my colleague Malcolm Chisholm, and to mention a forthcoming event. Lunchtime on the Wednesday, the 9th of October, I'm hosting a presentation on behalf of Lorna Walker, who's worked all her lives with those with learning difficulties. She's produced an online support manual to deal with those with additional support needs. It's been used by half of councillors across Scotland. There's interest from across the world, unfortunately not so far from the government, and I would urge the Minister, if he can, to come along. I do support the strategy, but I support the amendment in our name. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now call on George Adam to be followed by Rhoda Grant. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Welcome the Keys to Life strategy and this debate. Obviously, it builds on the same as you, 2000 strategy in 2000. And I agree with Mary Scanlon that, you know, sometimes in this building we tend to strategise till the coos come home, effectively. And I think we've got to get to a situation, it's what we actually do with the very good information that's in front of us here, and ensuring that we do have the equality and the fairness in the society that Dennis Robertson and Stuart Stevenson mentioned in his intervention earlier on, and empowering people with learning disabilities. One of the things I noticed yesterday, I was at an event and it was by the Pace Theatre Company and Police Scotland. It was talking about disability hate crime. Effectively, Margaret McCulloch says we've moved so far forward in these things from the work done with Same As You in 2000. And this was actually showing a situation where there was someone who had learning disabilities living in the community. It's a very powerful drama where they were doing tours of the schools in Renfrewshire and just getting the message out there. Now, it showed how this individual had difficulties, 24-year-old man, had difficulties not just having to deal with, in this case, autism, but having also to deal with the fact that you know, some people weren't quite as understanding with his learning disabilities as well. And it was very powerful, but I was watching it and I was wondering to myself that, you know, would the ending ended up a lot happier and better because the mechanisms were there for that individual to actually try and make sure they got out of the difficulty they were in. But would that have been the same pre-2000, pre the strategies that we've had? Would that have been an availability for that individual? And I think it probably would have been difficult. You know, the Same As You strategy started everything off in 2000 and was successful in shifting the balance of care to support more people to live in their communities. And that's exactly what that play was discussing as well. And I think it's important that we also encourage local authorities to review their day centre care. Now, as a councillor, I had to go through, and it was quite a difficult process, to go through with the review of daycare centres and look at how we could do a new model, because some individuals still prefer some form of day centre care. And in Mirren Centre, in the Lagoon Centre in Paisley, we now have a type of facility that is modern and different, but the individuals involved at the time and their parents didn't want to actually move. The family members didn't want to move because they were comfortable where they were, but things have moved on and things have worked out. So I think we have to, although it's not easy, sometimes as politicians we have to make the decisions to possibly look at new ways of delivering services. And for these individuals, that was an example of you know, making progress, is identifying the needs of what the individuals needed and how we could make things better for them. One of the flexibility that I really like, and I think it was mentioned by the Minister as well, was he mentioned about the Self-Directed Support Act, and that gives the individual the flexibility to be within the community, live within their community and bring their life as their own, instead of people telling them how they should be receiving support. They are the ones that are deciding, all their family members working together to ensure that they are telling everyone exactly what they're looking for. And I think that's an extremely important part of this debate as well, because we can sit here and talk about what we think is best, but I think we have to engage with the families and people who have learning disabilities as well. you know, some of the many things that, yes, there has been mention of the Westminster unfair welfare reforms, which are going to have an effect with some of these families. These families are going to have great difficulty in dealing with things like the bedroom tax, which obviously the Scottish Government put £20 million to support. But we have to look at ways where we can continue to support these families, because it is, again, the tale of two governments, where there is one that's actually supporting its people and the other which seems to be having difficulty with that as well. I would actually like to talk about some of the recommendations now, Presiding Officer. You know, coming from a local government background, I like the Commissioning of Public Service Recommendation 3, whereas community planners should ensure that local arrangements for joint commission are developed across relevant partner agencies and service areas to support the delivery of the agreed outcomes. Now, I understand that's the way forward, but I think we need to make a way and find a way to package it so that individuals, you know, I've sat at local council meetings and engaged with the public where we've told them about the single outcome agreements and the like, and trying to get the language. Yes, no problem.
Minister Robertson. I thank Mr Arm for giving a brief intervention. He mentioned Recommendation 3 and he's supportive of Recommendation 3. We were talking about enabling and empowering and giving a voice to those with learning disabilities. Do you think those people with learning disabilities understand Recommendation 3?
I wouldn't actually like to answer that myself, but that's what I was trying to say, was the fact that we need to make sure that we speak in a language and package things in a way that people will be able to engage with it, because it's all well and good for us to talk about these things. We have to make sure that it's real and relevant to the individuals that we hope to help, and that's one of the things that I was saying, that we have to make sure that individuals get involved at that point. But some of the other recommendations, I think it's important. I've been involved in the community planning process at a local government level, and I've seen the difference it can make when you do engage with the groups and the individuals. Again, it's not so much putting the actual documentation in front of them, it's talking to them and finding out exactly what they're looking for and exactly what they're needing. And I used to spend, unfortunately I no longer have the time, Presiding Officer, but I used to be able to spend kind of full days listening to individuals actually discuss all their issues with the local community and what we can do. And I think that's something we have to ensure, that when we are doing these things, you know, don't just leave, Dennis Robertson's quite right, don't just leave the bits of paper there. The actual intention's correct, but make sure we package everything in a proper way. You know, the recommendation 11 with regards to health, and I think it was mentioned by Joan McAlpine as well, is that the Scottish Learning Disabilities Observatory will work to develop better understanding of the causes of unnecessary deaths of people with learning disabilities. Now, this is another thing that's you know, difficult for most of us to actually comprehend and understand. It's something that, in general, we tend to accept, which is wrong. You know, and we have to have a situation where we can actually find out how that is and how we can bring that forward. So, in closing, Presiding Officer, the Keys to Life strategy offers us a direction of travel. Much has been improved in our communities over the years, but there's still so much more that we can achieve.
Many thanks. Now call on Rhoda Grant to be followed by Jamie Hepburn. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I too welcome the strategy outlined in the Key to Life that builds on the same as you. And there are some really comprehensive sections in the strategy and others that possibly need some more work to take them forward. The health section highlights the challenges and the health inequalities experienced by people with learning difficulties. Some of those are due to health difficulties that form part of that individual's disability, but others are due to poor communication between those with learning disability and health professionals. And I'm really pleased that NHS Western Isles is leading the way in training staff in better communication with people with learning disabilities, and that good practice is being mainstreamed throughout Scotland. However, we need to remember that people with learning disabilities are the same as everybody else, and that their well-being and fulfilment is key to a healthy life. The key to ensuring that we understand what causes these inequalities, so that we can develop services to improve health and prevent illness. And bad health stops people with learning disabilities from enjoying activities such as employment and education that contribute to a fulfilled life. But it's the same the other way around, in the way that lack of fulfilment can impact on somebody's health. Therefore, improving communication with people with learning difficulties and health care professionals is important. But it can't end there. The communication channels need to be improved across the various services that each individual interacts with. That will help identify problems that occur and also help the various agencies and individuals to work together quickly and efficiently resolving problems. And I was really heartened to see that some health boards in Inverclyde, for example, were targeting their public health information to people with learning disabilities and helping them take on that message. But we need the specialist services as well as communication, because communication can only go so far. And these services need to be accessible and properly funded to enable individuals to be supported to improve not just their health, but their general well-being. And this happens with a backdrop of local authorities' cuts, for example, and that leads to increased care charges. Some people are being charged up to 100% of their care package, and we've heard others talk about the human rights of those with learning disabilities. Well, surely the ability to live your life to the full must be a human right, and we must look at those charges to make sure that nobody has a funding issue when it comes to living their lives to the full. And this as well has the backdrop of welfare cuts again, which very much impact on those with learning disabilities. So I think that is a work in progress, and I hope the strategy will look to tackle this. We have had some successes in looking at health issues for those with learning disabilities and an emphasis on health conditions that are part of a wider condition. And for instance, people with Down syndrome have now an extended life expectancy that has increased a great deal over the last decade. But I really welcome the further research into this, because I think we can do much that will improve life expectancy for different conditions, and I think that is to be welcomed in the strategy. Can I turn briefly to self-directed support? And I think while this is welcome, there is a real concern that sometimes those packages are an opportunity to actually cut packages, and that's a real concern for people, both carers and those with learning disabilities. We have to recognise as well that people with learning disabilities are vulnerable and need safeguards in the system to protect them. They often fall prey to unscrupulous people who would abuse their relationships with them. And we often hear of people when they receive, for example, their benefits being preyed upon and those benefits being taken and then they are abandoned with nothing. Self-directed care uses personal assistants who need no qualifications to carry out their roles. We have to make really sure that those people who would prey on those with learning disabilities can't use this as a way of making money out of those with learning difficulties. There also needs to be safeguards in assessing need, and I've heard a case where a person with learning disabilities had a self-assessment completed for them without them even being present. Had they been present on their own, they might have downplayed their need as well, because, as we know, many people with learning disabilities crave independence. They've been wrapped up in cotton wool by friends and families for too long and really want to decide for themselves. So one of the real challenges we face in self-directed care is to empower individuals while making sure that there is protections in the system there for them as well. Can I also turn to supported workplaces, because I think all this is integral, and I was speaking to staff at a social enterprise cafe in Inverness, artisans that provides training places for people with learning disability and other issues that require supported employment. And they told me that they were not getting as many people coming through their service as quickly as they would wish, because there was a lack of jobs for people to move on to in the community. Most public bodies have policies about employing disabled people, but such posts are rare. And therefore, people who are ready to move on from supported employment and are able to hold down a job really can't. If we're serious about this, we need to ring-fence more jobs for people with learning disabilities. And it's disappointing that there's actually a drop in people in those ring-fence jobs that are currently available from 318 in 2011 to 2012. We need more of those places, not less. And I think the Scottish Government can lead the way by looking at their own organisation and ring-fencing jobs, as well as encouraging agencies and indeed contractors to do the same. It not only helps people with learning disabilities reach their own full potential, but it's also crucial to their well-being. And it also has the role of educating the wider population about what people with learning disabilities have to offer. Yes, we need supported workplaces, but we also need mainstream jobs for them to move on to. And I think just as a quick end, I just point out that I was at a Carers Forum question and answer last week, and I heard that one of the people who was in supported employment was actually being charged more for that place than they were earning for taking part. And I think that was an awful lot to demeaning that person's contributions to society. So I think we need to look at those wider issues about health and therefore tackle well-being and improve health in the long term.
Many thanks. Now call on Jamie Hepburn to be followed by Stuart Stevenson. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I think we could probably take as our starting position that we all of us in this chamber, agree on the need to get it right for those who have a learning disability. I won't re-rehearse the precise figures, but they have been set out, and there is a significant number of people in Scotland with a recognised learning disability, and they deserve the support of this Parliament to live full, active and dignified lives. And in that basis, I think it's understandable that there's been much consensus across the chamber, and I very much welcome the document we debate, the keys to life, and I thought it was useful that one of its findings was that people with learning disabilities tell us that they are more accepted and valued in our communities than ever before. That's clearly positive. I'm sure we all regard that as so, but of course we cannot fall back on complacency. In that regard, Malcolm Chisholm was absolutely right to make that point. So I think, again, we can all agree on the need to do more to assist those with learning disabilities. And in that regard, Presiding Officer, I very much welcome the amendment from the Conservatives, which is not something that I regularly am inclined to say in this chamber, but I particularly welcome that part of their amendment which refers to the need to consider that particular attention should be paid to the transition between a child and adult services. Members, I think, all members will be aware that this is a particular challenge for young people with learning disabilities. The post-education destination outcome for such individuals is not as good for as for the population more generally, and it's important then to consider how we can best improve upon this record. And I have to say, President Officer, there's actually quite a good example in my own constituency. In my constituency, there is Glencryan School, which is a special educational needs school, not only dealing with pupils with a learning disability, but such students form a part of the school population. And I've been very impressed with their efforts to equip pupils with practical vocational skills in a range of areas. They actually run a bistro, a laundrette, where customers from the local area can come in, and the students themselves are involved in undertaking the activity in these areas, giving people, these young people, real skills, and I think also equally importantly confidence in themselves and in their own abilities. And I think they have certainly improved the positive destinations of some of their students compared to what might have been the case in the past. And I think it's very much a success story. And it was very disappointing to learn about the experience of the son of Mary Scanlon's constituent. I certainly know that it doesn't always go right in my own area from my own bitter experience of having had to assist some constituents. I know that isn't the case, but I do wonder if that particular young man was attending Glencryan School,
maybe if his experience might have been rather better than the disappointing experience that Mary Scanlon was able to set out. So in that regard, I believe that a lot can be learned from the Glencrine experience. I've been very pleased to welcome Angela Constance in her capacity as Minister for Youth Employment to the school in the past, and if the Minister for Public Health fancies a short trip from his Falkirk West constituency, I'm sure we can arrange for that as well. And I do also recognise that this challenge of ensuring better outcomes for young people with learning disabilities is one that is encompassed within the keys to life. In the Break the Stereotypes section, recommendation 39 sets out that by 2014, stakeholders should provide earlier, smoother and clearer transition pathways to include accessible information on their options, rights to benefits and self-directed support for all children with learning disabilities to enable them to plan and prepare for the transition from school to leavers destination. And recommendation 41 also sets out that the Learning Disability Implementation Group should work with a range of other organisations to develop supported employment opportunities for people with learning disabilities, and indeed that the organisations involved should lead by example by employing more people with learning disabilities. In recommendation 42, it talks about how we can try and develop work skills for young people with learning disabilities in tandem with the third sector. So it's pretty clear that these are concrete examples of how the strategy we debate today can affect meaningful change for those who have a learning disability, and particularly those in transition from childhood to adulthood as well. And I look forward to progress in these ambitions being reported back to this Parliament. Can I also say, President Officer, we recently saw the 60th anniversary of the European Convention on Human Rights, and human rights are of course important to everyone, but particularly for those who may be considered to be more vulnerable. And I'm glad to see that the Keys to Life very much recognises the issue of human rights. And I want to quote from the Independent Living section of the Keys to Life, because I think this particular quote encompasses the sense of how human rights of those with learning disabilities can be embedded. And that section starts off by saying the Independent Living in Scotland project describes independent living as disabled people of all ages having the same freedom, choice, dignity and control as other citizens at home, at work and in the community. It does not mean living by yourself or fending for yourself. It means rights to practical assistance and support to participate in society and live an ordinary life. And Inclusion Scotland, President Officer, I think they rightly make the point that it's important to recognise that this definition actually came from disabled people themselves. In other words, this is how such individuals aspire to have their human rights recognised and put into practice. And I think at the end of the day, that is probably actually, given we have a range of 52 recommendations, some of which I have quoted, I think that sense of ensuring the rights of people with learning disabilities is probably the most important element of the document. So I very much welcome it as a publication. I think it's evidence that the Scottish Government is doing what it can to support those in Scotland with a learning disability.
Many thanks. Now calling Stuart Stevenson to be followed by Jim Hume. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And let me apologise for my absence towards the end of the opening speeches. I was called away unexpectedly, but I'm glad to be back and participate in this important debate. It's a debate which, when it's led by the Health Minister and key participants are people who've got a long-standing engagement in health, it's a debate that carries with it the danger of being viewed as a health issue. It is, of course, nothing of the sort. It is a quality of life issue. It has health as an issue within it. It has access to culture, to recreation, to the emotional life of those who are disadvantaged. And as Dennis Robertson in particular focused on, generating respect for people who we may see as different to ourselves. And yet, for people with learning difficulties, they see themselves as normal and us as deviating from their normality. And we should never forget that that is the case. We're the oddballs to the people who are the subject of the debate. It is not them who are the oddballs. Now, very nearly 50 years ago, 1964, spent the time between school and university working in a locked ward in Stratheeden Hospital in Fife. I was 17 at the time. We had 32 beds there. We were working a 108-hour fortnight as members of staff. We used to work double shifts Saturday and Sunday and then get the other weekend off. We were chronically understaffed. We should have had 6. There was one weekend we had 2 of us, and from time to time I was in charge of the ward. 17 years old, not a single day of formal training whatsoever. So what kind of people did we used to have in Ward M2 of Stratheeden Hospital? We had a couple of people who were former Carstairs patients. We had people suffering catatonia. We had people suffering the general paralysis of the insane from alcohol, from tertiary syphilis. We had severely paranoid people. In one case, we had a gentleman from Poland who had spent time in a gulag in the Soviet Union, and his mental ill health came from that. And it was in this environment that we also had people who are the subject of today's debate. An environment as far removed from what would be suitable to meet their needs as it is possible to imagine. There was one of them in particular, we'll just call him Willie. That was his name. I'm sure he's no longer with us, so I can speak about him. Willie was actually quite competent. He could go to the shop and buy things for us. He could interact with visitors in the hospital grounds. And yet, 50 years ago, Willie and the likes of Willie and his friends across Scotland were in locked wards in psychiatric hospitals. So things have got better. Let's not kid ourselves about that. But in the 7 months that I worked... Yes, I shall.
Dennis Robertson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The member accept that there's an absolute vast difference between mental health and learning disabilities. Because, you know, we've got to be careful that we don't stray into the areas of mental health issues rather than focusing on learning disabilities.
The member makes my point for me, that we treated what is very far from mental health as if it were a mental ill health problem in the past, and I hope we never return to these days. In the 7 months I worked in that 32-bed ward, we had a single visitor. A single visitor. People were entirely isolated from the world. So how many people have we got? We've heard various numbers. It's 1 in 100. It might be 1 in 40. The interesting thing is what kind of things are accessible to almost everyone in our society, including people with learning disabilities. I did Getting It Right for Every Child event when I was a minister, filling in for one of my colleagues in Aberdeen. And before I went on to do my little bit, we had a film of a 1-hour-old infant, 1 hour out of the womb, responding to music, waving the hands in time with the beat of music. And I'm not a dad, so I haven't perhaps seen this miracle that others have seen. And I was fascinated by this. And it immediately echoed with me that when I've worked with and been with people with learning disability, music is one of the things to which they can respond and contribute in a very decisive and important way. So let's not forget the importance of culture, access to the opportunities to contribute to culture. We've got related issues like autism, where we've got the autism strategy that was launched nearly 2 years ago. And it's a very interesting strategy because it has something that I'm not so clearly seeing in what's before us here. Yes, 52 or thereabouts recommendations, but less clearly a single, cohesive, integrated aim. The autism strategy, by contrast, has one. So let me propose what really our aim here is, and that is to deliver to people with learning disabilities the best available quality of life that is particular to their individual needs and opportunities, and where possible to do so in a way that does not require support, but providing support when it's required. So rather than have everybody who's engaged in this issue having to remember 52 recommendations, let's get to a position where everybody has a single thing in their mind that they can carry forward. Presiding Officer, the debate today is part of a continuity of effort that has gone on from the very resumption of this Parliament in 1999. Predecessors in office did a lot. We build on that, and that's absolutely good. My wife frequently goes for her afternoon coffee to the Boyndy Centre in my constituency, an excellent centre that provides employment and opportunities to socialise for many people with learning difficulties. A good example which we'll all have in our own constituencies, our own lives. An excellent debate. Congratulations to the Minister for giving us this opportunity.
Many thanks. I now call on Jim Hume, after which we move to closing speeches.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I too welcome the publication of the Scottish Government's latest strategy for improving the quality of life for those with learning disabilities, and also, of course, welcome the opportunity to debate that strategy this afternoon. I think that all of us know friends or family that have been affected to some extent, and we've had good contributions this afternoon, and I think a constructive debate. The way people have been treated in the past to how they are treated now are absolutely leagues apart. It would be churlish of any of us to suggest that there has been no improvement to the quality of life for those in our society with learning disabilities. There has been significant progress since Same As You was published in the year 2000, and there have been undoubtedly a number of successes. This had been the first real attempt in decades, I think, to take a strategic and overarching look at service provision for those with learning disabilities. In the past decade, many people with learning disabilities have been able to set up their own homes and live independently in the community. They've also been empowered and afforded a level of visibility which had hitherto been alien. And the closure of the remaining long-stay hospitals for people with learning disabilities in Scotland was another welcome step. One of the big success stories coming out of the Same As You recommendations was surely the creation of the Scottish Consortium for Learning Disability, SCLD, which brought together partner organisations to coordinate the improved delivery of services for those with learning difficulties. Just speaking a few weeks ago, the Chief Executive of SCLD, Chris Cregan, said, and I quote, "You can't change decades of institutionalisation and prejudice and relative invisibility in just a few years. There is still a lot of work to do." End quote. Despite the success and progress that has been made, there is indeed still much work to do. I'm pleased to see that the Minister acknowledges this in his motion, and is often the case whenever we consider issues relating to the well-being of individuals, inequalities stand out as the biggest barrier to greater outcomes for those with learning disabilities. Along with Enable Scotland and the Learning Disability Alliance, I too welcome the Government's focus on tackling inequalities. It's staggering to be reminded that those with learning disabilities will, on average, live 20 years less than the general population. Many will even live shorter lives than some smokers in some of the more deprived areas of this country. Only when we begin to tackle the root causes of this appalling anomaly can we be truly satisfied that the quality of life of those with learning disabilities is on a par with the rest of us. I'm pleased to see the strategy aims to identify the reasons behind the gulf in respective life expectancies and to ensure that the relevant agencies and authorities know where the responsibilities lie. So perhaps the Social Care Health Integration Bill may keep this in focus. Another component of inequalities the Scottish Government must seek to address concerns the employment of people with learning disabilities. The ESA stats for 2012 highlight that 3/4 of those known to have a learning difficulty are not currently in employment or training, with only 1/5 of those who are employed working more than 16 hours per week. With meaningful paid employment comes a sense of value and inclusion,
but more importantly also strengthens the individual's ability to live independently. That is why supported employment opportunities are so crucial to the well-being of those with learning disability. Therefore, the inclusion of Recommendation 41, which seeks to develop a range of supported employment opportunities in the third sector, local authorities and NHS boards, will be beneficial, as is suggesting that they lead the way by employing more people with learning disabilities themselves. The Conservative amendment, which we will support, as well as the Government motion, makes the pertinent point about ensuring a smooth transition from child to adult services. The 39th recommendation, don't worry, I'm not going to go through them all, in the strategy is incredibly important in the respect, but it is also vital that the Scottish Government do monitor the performance of councils, Skills Development Scotland and other agencies to evaluate their success in providing these clearer and smoother post-16 transition pathways. I would be keen to hear in the summing up from the Minister how this will be monitored to ensure adherence by the relevant parties. Deputy Presiding Officer, with just over 26,000 people known, I stress known, to local authorities as having learning difficulties, this is clearly a not insignificant number of people. The strategy is not perfect, but has in part been shaped by stakeholders and does provide a blueprint from which further progress can be made. It's now up to the Scottish Government and us all to ensure that those tasked with those making progress do so. Thank you. Many thanks. We now move to closing speeches, and I call on Annette Milne, 6 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Like others across the Chamber, I too would like to welcome the new Learning Disabilities Strategy. But in line with what Dennis Robertson, George Adam and the Learning Disabilities Alliance have said, I would say that the language of the recommendations in the Keys to Life report is somewhat complex, and I must say I found the easy-to-read version very helpful. I don't know why such a report couldn't be couched in simple language for everyone, and I say this with feeling after another evidence-taking session on the Public Bodies Joint Working Scotland Bill, a title which I find quite difficult to reconcile with its integration of adult health and social care intention. The Keys to Life report is, however, an important document, and this has been an important and an interesting debate. It's fair to say that we've come a long way since the publication of The Same as You 13 years ago, but we mustn't become complacent, and we should recognise that there's always more to be done. That said, there's no doubt that the appropriate care of people with learning difficulties is taken much more seriously now than it once was, and it's heartening to learn that over 1,000 adults with learning disabilities have moved out of special hospitals and into homes within the community. I can well remember the very real concerns of parents in Aberdeen when plans were being made to move their children, some of them very severely disabled and approaching adulthood, from long-stay hospital into the community. By and large, they settled in well, and now it's taken for granted that such people will live in supported homes within the community. I also recall the happiness of a 70-year-old lady showing me her sheltered flat, her first real home after a lifetime in institutional care. If further progress is to be made, however, then people with learning difficulties must be given a say over the services they receive and a greater degree of control over their own lives. That's why I was happy to support the social care self-directed support legislation, which will enable more people to lead a normal life of their choosing and within their community, despite their disabilities. It will extend freedom, enable choice, and empower individuals to direct the terms of their care. Recommendation 5 of Keys to Life recognises this and wisely suggests that local authorities and NHS partners work creatively to ensure that people with learning disabilities have access to a wide range of providers. And I absolutely agree with Malcolm Chisholm about the need to involve the third sector in the provision of care. On independent living, human rights and the delivery of public services, the report has some important things to say, and it rightly recognises the health inequalities and difficulties faced by many people with learning disabilities and signposts the way to overcoming them. I certainly recognise the significance of joined-up thinking for these people, particularly in health, and I would like to see more being done to ensure that those with learning disabilities receive effective health care on equal terms. And I therefore welcome the Minister's initiatives in this, particularly his decision to look at the GP contract, because primary care is key to supporting the health of people with learning disabilities. Presiding Officer, the report's heavy on recommendations and awash with potential reviews to improve health care for people with learning disabilities, but it says very little about a life plan for them as they move from childhood into the adult world. There's little about employment, although there's a real need, where appropriate, to move such people into meaningful paid work. According to Capability Scotland, the gap in unemployment rates between disabled and non-disabled people has grown over the last 9 years, with recent statistics showing there were 653 fewer adults with learning disabilities in Scotland known to be working last year than in the previous year. This is a big problem and deserves to be treated as such. I note the words of Peter Scott, Chairman of the Scottish Consortium for Learning Disability, who said that while the trend towards more independent living is welcome, there is an underlying concern that whether in relation to education, employment or day services, opportunities for people may be diminishing. He's absolutely right. Keys to Life states that only a quarter of people with learning disabilities were in employment or training for employment when last surveyed, and only a fifth of that number worked for over 16 hours a week. Of course, there are success stories. For instance, the Bread Maker, a pioneering social firm in Aberdeen, which provides a range of meaningful employment, training and educational opportunities for up to 20 adults with learning disabilities. But such businesses are few and far between, and it's clear that a lot more could be done to help people with learning difficulties to enter the world of work. Both the Dornan Review and the Curriculum for Excellence argue that every child has the right to become a successful learner, a confident individual, an effective contributor and a responsible citizen, wherever their learning is taking place. So while this has been shown to hold when a child or young person is in primary or secondary education, we have made less progress in the period following school, and we must do better there, as our amendment suggests. We owe nothing less to the nearly 16,000 pupils with learning disabilities who are currently in Scottish schools. Indeed, it's for this reason that I think we must boost the number of such people in modern apprenticeships. The fact that only 0.3% of placements are filled by someone with a learning disability is quite shocking. If we're truly serious about improving quality of life, then we must do more to ensure that people with learning disabilities acquire the right skills which enable them to grasp the right opportunities. In summary, Presiding Officer, I welcome the report and I believe that its recommendations point towards a more cohesive environment of support and care. But words only go so far. And if we're really to improve the quality of life of those with learning disabilities, we must focus hard on implementation. I congratulate those involved in producing the Keys to Life report, and I hope that in time the challenges outlined today will come to be fully addressed. I'm happy to support the motion and the amendment in Mary Scanlon's name.
Many thanks. I now call on Jackie Minutes, 9 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And like others, I welcome the opportunity to debate the new Learning Disabilities Strategy. I'm not sure whether I'm required to declare this as an interest, but I am indeed very proud to be the convener of the cross-party group on learning disability and include my colleagues, both Jim Eadie and Joan McAlpine, in taking an active interest in the group. Can I at the start welcome the Minister's acknowledgement that much was achieved with the previous strategy, the same as you. Things like the closure of long-stay institutions like Lennox Castle so that over 1,000 people moved into homes in the community. More people with learning disabilities having the opportunity to go to college than was ever the case in the past. And many more people with learning disabilities accessing and sustaining employment. But you know, probably one of the most important things for me about the same as you was the approach. I remember the early draft, which Ian Gray tore up, and the reason for this is that we failed to engage directly with those with learning disabilities and their families. The strategy went back to the drawing board, and there was complete involvement and engagement of people with learning disabilities in shaping the policy, in shaping the services, in short, in shaping the kind of future they wanted to see. The slogan, "Nothing about us without us," should underpin everything that we do in this Parliament. So whilst welcoming the new strategy, let me just very gently register my disappointment that it wasn't developed in that extensive consultation with people with learning disabilities and their families. There was no public engagement that we were aware of, certainly not in my community and certainly not with the cross-party group. Solutions that are bottom-up, I think we would all agree, are always better than solutions that are top-down. And I would urge the Minister to look at ways to ensure that people with learning disabilities and their families are involved in overseeing the implementation of the strategy and make co-production a reality for them all. And I will deal with process at this point, because I remember, Presiding Officer, albeit vaguely, how government works from my time as a minister. So let me share some important lessons that I learned. The strategy contains 52 recommendations. Much has been made of that, some more substantial indeed than others. But where is the action plan, the measurable targets, the milestones? Because we need these if we are able to measure progress and, of course, success. It is the government's responsibility to ensure that aspirations are turned into action. So how will the Minister monitor implementation, secure agreement from partners like colleges and local authorities? And are there, for example, even measures for people with learning disability in some of our local authorities' single outcome agreements? But if we are to make a difference to the lives of disabled people with learning disabilities, we must focus on what matters. And I urge the Minister to ensure that this is not another strategy that gets left on the shelf gathering dust. Please, please, put in a monitoring framework, give it teeth, because you will have our complete support if you do that. There is no doubt that if implemented, many of these recommendations can make a difference. That's why it's so important that you monitor them. And like many others, Bob Doris, Stuart Maxwell, Malcolm Chisholm, too many to name, I want to support the comprehensive recommendations tackling the appalling health inequalities for people with learning disability. And I support, too, the approach that puts equality and human rights at the heart of everything that we do, because this is a fundamental matter of rights. It is, however, important to recognise the challenges, of which there are a number. And let me just touch briefly on 4. The first is welfare cuts, and it may be uncomfortable for those parties in the UK coalition, but I am clear that the sweeping changes being made to our welfare system are having an absolutely disproportionate impact on disabled people. Whether it's the bedroom tax or changes to disability living allowance, there is real fear about what lies ahead. Many are already accumulating rent arrears because of the bedroom tax. And with the removal of the lower rate of the daily living element of DLA, many will lose some of their income. We need to address these fears, and we need to address them because they are becoming people's realities. The second area I want to touch on is college cuts. And Joan McAlpine was absolutely right to praise the work of the Transitions to Employment project being taken forward by Enable and the Scottish Consortium for Learning Disabilities. I don't think anybody would disagree with her. But as I said, this doesn't plug the cuts to college funding. By all means, let's absolutely join together to improve quality, but let's not at the same time cut resources, because there have been cuts. And I'm not saying that to score points. I believe it actually undermines the strategy that the Minister is trying to bring forward. Enable, Presiding Officer, did a survey of colleges in 2012, and they tell us that college courses have been cut by over 46% in the last 2 years. Teaching staff for people with additional support needs cut by 16% in the last 2 years, and a 20% cut in the number of adults with learning disability attending college. None of that should make us happy. The third challenge is employment. Increasing numbers of adults with learning disabilities are failing to secure employment. Indeed, the numbers fell by 16% in 2012, and the trend seems to be downward. But that is in the context that the numbers in employment in the first place are relatively small. The fourth challenge is social care, and people in this chamber will be bored of me talking about this, because across Scotland there are still different charges. The postcode lottery of care still exists. Not only are there different charges, there's different eligibility criteria. There are 32 ways of doing things. And whilst I believe absolutely in the ability of local government to do the best for their local community, Scotland, frankly, is not big enough to have such wild variations, and I'll touch on them in a minute. But the Scottish Government and COSLA set up a working group over 2 years ago to deal with this, yet disparities still remain. I once jokingly said, Presiding Officer, that if they were on performance-related pay, we would be withholding their payment. Frankly, I'm not joking anymore. Neil Bibby pointed out a truly shocking statistic, that people living in 25 out of our 32 local authorities are being charged for their care at a rate higher than the top rate of income tax for the wealthiest in this country. And let me give you some examples of the disparity. One council charges £111 for a single day at a day centre. Another charges just £6. One council charges £8.28 as the hourly rate for home care. Another charges £23.70. Scotland isn't such a big country that this variation can be allowed to continue. Can I finish, Presiding Officer, by saying that Ken Macintosh was in part right. It was, in fact, David Cameron that said that the burden of austerity would fall on those with the broadest shoulders. Clearly, he then just ignored his own words, because the burden hasn't fallen on the bankers or the millionaires in his cabinet. They get off scot-free, whilst the burden has truly fallen on the poorest in society. I support the government motion and the strategy, but we need robust implementation and monitoring arrangements if we are truly to make a real difference. Thank you.
I now call the Minister to wind up the debate. Minister, I'd appreciate if you could go till 5 o'clock. Michael Matheson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I begin by thanking everyone for their contribution during the course of debate? I think it's been a very useful debate. This chamber has debated issues around learning disability on a fairly regular basis, but this is the first opportunity we've had to debate the new strategy, the first new strategy of its type in over 10 years. And I recognise that there is always a hefty degree of cynicism, or scepticism, I should say, about the use of strategies and whether they make a real difference to people's lives. And I think having a healthy degree of scepticism on the benefit of strategies is a good thing, because I have a healthy degree of scepticism about strategies. But I say that to give assurance to members that when I bring forward a strategy, I'm determined to do everything in my power to do exactly as Neil Bibby believes it has to do, is to make a difference to people's lives. Now, I think it'd be fair to say that, as Jim Eadie said in his contribution, no party has a monopoly on the issues around learning disability. And it'd be fair to say that a number of individuals have made reference to the way we saw an ever-increasing decline of long-stay beds for those with learning disabilities. That didn't start with the Same As You strategy. That started back in the early 90s, actually under the Conservative government, when we started to close institutions like the Royal Scottish National Hospital, which I used to often have clients based in. That's a process that's built up over a 20 to 30-year period. If I have a criticism as to what happened then, there was a lack of a community strategy to provide the right type of support, and Same As You then came along and helped to provide that type of cohesion and strategy that was necessary to build on the progress that had been made with the closure of long-stay hospitals. And the key part about this strategy is not to say that this strategy is better than the last strategy, it's to build on the progress that has been achieved. And I noticed in Neil Bibby's comments that he had a degree of scepticism as to whether we were going to be ambitious enough, as had been the case with the Same As You strategy. It would be fair to say that there was a significant period of the Same As You strategy which was then taken forward by this government as well. So there is no lack of determination on our part to do everything we can to make sure that this new strategy is one that can make a real difference to people's lives. But I also understand that in doing so, that it can't be something which can be achieved by government on its own. Just like the drafting of the new strategy was not achieved by government on its own. There was input from a whole range of different stakeholders into what the content of a new strategy should actually look like. And we then finally took that along in partnership with COSLA in recognition of the fact that local authorities have a lead role in taking forward a range of services to help to support both those with a learning disability and their carers. But what I do recognise that although government, if I can just finish this point, I'll give way to Mr Robertson. If there's one thing I think it's important to recognise is that government itself will not achieve everything it's set out in the strategy. It's a strategy that will have to be delivered in partnership with a range of stakeholders. The NHS, local authorities and, importantly, as Malcolm Chisholm highlighted, the third sector, who I believe have an extremely important role to help to deliver a range of the recommendations contained within this strategy. So that partnership helped to frame the strategy in itself, as has been the case in the past with previous strategies, and that partnership will also be key to making sure that in 10 years' time we can review this strategy and recognise that it has built on the progress that was made through the Same As You, and it has made a real difference to people's lives. And what we need to do is to make sure we take that forward in a way that makes a real difference to people's lives. And on that note, I'll give way to Mr Robertson.
Dennis Robertson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Minister has just said we're working in partnership with various stakeholders. We've got government, COSLA, NHS, third sector. Would the Minister acknowledge that the most important stakeholder in all this, in taking this forward, is the individual with a learning disability?
Minister.
Oh, I completely agree with that. I think there is a danger at times when we start to talk about some aspects of health policy or social care policy that it becomes too process-driven, that the patient or the individual becomes secondary to the process in itself. And the key to this strategy is that if it does the types of things that Dennis Robertson said in his own contribution, when he made reference to the fact that it needs to make sure that we provide those with a learning disability, we treat them with dignity, with equality and, importantly, with respect. And this is a strategy that can help us to achieve that. But I want to pick up on a few of the themes that have emerged over the course of the debate this afternoon. You know, there's been obviously the ping-pong around the issue of education and access to college courses. Joan McAlpine mentioned the approach that's been taken now by the government. Jim Eadie mentioned it, Neil Bibby mentioned it, Jackie Bailey just mentioned it, Stuart Maxwell mentioned it in his contribution as well. One of the things that I think is extremely important here is that those with a learning disability making access to education services, whether that be in schools or whether it be at college, is for a purpose. Particularly at college, it is for a purpose. It's not a course which someone is parked on for the sake of doing a course, but it actually leads to some positive outcome for that individual. And I think that's extremely important because I know there has been a tendency in the past for individuals with a learning disability to be parked on college courses, that they're doing something, it appears worthwhile, but the outcome of it is that it changes nothing in their life. So one of the approaches that we've been taking, and I'll give you an example of that, is to make sure that we have our colleges and the rest of the sector working more effectively to identify the right types of opportunities for those with a learning disability that have a more positive outcome and destination for them. That it's not going from one college course to the next college course because that appears to be what they're simply interested in doing. And one of the ways that we have to make sure that we build on that is to increase the employment opportunities for those with a learning disability as well. Now, I acknowledge the very significant challenge there is in addressing this particular issue, and Jackie Bailey mentioned the statistics in her own contribution. But we're providing funding to the Scottish Consortium for Learning Disability for Project Search, a project which is a one-year programme of supported work experience, which has a guaranteed interview at the end of that process with a view to going on to employment. We've got 6 of those pilots in the country operating in order to evaluate how effective that model can be delivered in partnership with the third sector. The key will be to learn from that partnership, and then to make sure that we look at scaling that up on a more consistent basis. And as Rhoda Grant, if I recall correctly, in her contribution suggested, that when it comes to creating employment opportunities for those with a learning disability, then we should lead by example that government agencies and public agencies should do exactly that. And that's what the strategy sets out in Recommendation 14. Our education bodies, our local authorities, our health boards, government all play a part in creating those opportunities for individuals to be able to get into employment. And in doing that, we can make sure that we get a better link between education and also get into employment. I'll give way to Jackie Bailey.
And I thank the Minister for taking the intervention. We agree substantially on the need to improve quality. We agree on having positive outcomes that lead people into employment. But can I ask you, given the cuts, is he able today to make a commitment that we will provide for the same number of learning disabled people, or indeed more, to experience this new quality service?
Minister.
Well, I think this is the danger here, is that we lose focus on improving the outcomes for those with a learning disability when they go into an education provision and then look to move on to employment. And that has been lacking in the past. And that's what the strategy sets out to try and address. The other key theme that has been highlighted by a number of those speaking in debate has been the issue of health inequalities. No, as a country, we face very stark health inequalities within our society. But the fact that they happen to be exacerbated by the fact that someone happens to have a learning disability is simply unacceptable. And what we need to do, now having identified those marked health inequalities, as I mentioned in my opening contribution, that 20 years less of a life expectancy because you happen to have a learning disability is just not tolerable in a modern-day society. But having identified that inequality, what we now have to do is to make sure we understand what the drivers are and what works in addressing it. And that's why we're providing funding to the Observatory in order to undertake that type of detailed work, so that we can make sure that we understand it better and that we also measure the approach that we're taking to see whether it's closing down that gap. That we don't get into a process of projectitis, a project that's meant to deliver some type of reduction in inequalities, but at the end of it, it doesn't deliver what it was intended to do. And that work by the Observatory will be absolutely crucial in making sure we do that. And that's why we're also taking forward a heat standard to make sure that all of our boards are under an obligation to actually collect that information. But key to also closing down that gap for those with a learning disability is to make sure that our primary care is set up in a way that it is also providing the right type of support to those with a learning disability. And I think, as Joan McAlpine made in her contribution, the need for us to look at that within the new GP contract, which we've given a commitment to do, to see how we can build upon that, to make sure that they are providing the right type of support. Presiding Officer, in the final few seconds of my contribution, a number of members made reference to the importance of self-directed support, the real difference that can make to an individual's life, and giving them the opportunity and control that they want over how their care is provided. I recognise the challenges for local authorities in this, particularly the challenge that the locus of control shifts from the professional to the individual themselves. But that in itself, I believe, is an important step and a reflection of the direction that we must move in. Presiding Officer, the way in which we treat some of the most vulnerable members in our community, including those with a learning disability, is a reflection of our society and a reflection of our society's values. Significant progress has been made over the last couple of decades in making sure that those with a learning disability are treated with fairness, respect and equality within our society. There is clearly much more we have to do, and I believe that this is a strategy which will allow us to achieve that in the coming years.
That concludes the debate on new learning disability strategy, the keys to life. We move to decision time. There are 3 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is amendment number 7787.2 in the name of Neil Bibby, which seeks to amend motion number 7787 in the name of Michael Matheson on new learning disability strategy. The keys to life be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 7787.2 in the name of Neil Bilby is as follows. Yes, 28. No, 77. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is amendment number 7787.1 in the name of Mary Scanlon, which seeks to amend motion number 7787 in the name of Michael Matheson on new learning disability strategy. The keys to life be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 7787 in the name of Michael Matheson as amended on new learning disability strategy. The keys to life be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Members who leave the chamber should now do so quickly and quietly.